If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 141, Florigato is a little girl. Will followed Leaf into the drawing room of the mansion. Find a place to sit, Septal. I got a call from Uncle Tom a month ago, Leaf said, flopping onto a sofa. I just didn't expect you to arrive so late. He called me so many times during that period, he was worried sick. He then waved at a butler standing in the corner. The butler bowed and left the room. A minute later, he returned, holding a black and gold poke ball. Will recognized it at a glance, a luxury ball. The luxury ball, the rich man's ball. Although its manufacturing cost was no different from other poke balls, and the success rate of crafting one was 20 times higher than Florigato's friend ball, it was still expensive. The reason was that the interior of a luxury ball was extremely comfortable, and a Pokémon caught with it would become friendly with its trainer much more easily. Blastoise, come on out and be our translator, Leaf said, tapping the ball. A large creature was released. A 1.8 meter tall Blastoise. Very strong, Will noted, giving the Blastoise a second look. Its level was likely upwards of 50. It seemed the townspeople didn't know the true strength of this fisherman. Blastoise, to be precise, he's not my Pokémon, but my brother. His mother and my mother were partners, and we were both born on the same day, Leaf explained, noticing Will's gaze. Will was stunned. It was the first time he had heard of such a relationship. But in the world of Pokémon, it seemed to be a relatively normal thing. Born on the same day, then this Blastoise must be in its 20s, Will thought, looking at Leaf. He looked to be about 26, so the Blastoise had also lived for over 20 years. In the Blastoise family, that was still just a child. This, Will said, not wasting any more words. He took out the letter Tom had written from his backpack and handed it to Leaf. Leaf only glanced at it before handing it back. Tom had already told him everything on the phone. Over the past month, I've had my people in other cities ask around about a grovel, thinking you might have gotten lost. Half a month ago, my people found Azalea Town and learned from Nurse Joy that you had already left. You were on the right track. So I had them search the route a few more times, and finally got news from a Piku that you had left with a Lapras. A few days ago, a Lapras herd passed by the western coast of Johto. I had Officer Jenny ask them, and learned that you were all on the Gligar Island. These past 2 days, I had people stake out the island's perimeter. They didn't find a grovel, but they did just miss a Septal. Leaf spread his hands, a helpless look on his face. Sorry, Will said, his face turning red as he scratched his head. He hadn't expected Tom to have contacted Leaf a month in advance. He had thought Leaf didn't even know they were coming, which was why he had taken his sweet time. He didn't think he had made someone worry for so long. It's fine. It's a small matter. My master only chewed me out for half a month, that's all, Leaf said with a casual wave, though his tone was full of. The master he was talking about was, of course, Corpish, not Tom. Next, Leaf and Will began to discuss the trip to Blackthorn City. At the same time, Will borrowed Leaf's landline phone to call Granny Sola and Captain Tom to let them know he was safe. With Blastoise and Leaf translating, Will could communicate with them normally. The rapport between Leaf and his Blastoise was off the charts. Sometimes, for simple phrases, Blastoise only needed to exchange a look with Leaf, and the latter would understand. Will had no doubt that if they had a Megastone and a Keystone, they could Mega Evolve on the spot. In that case, you and the kitten can rest here for a day. We'll set out tomorrow. Leaf was a man of action. Once he confirmed Will's destination, he immediately had his people prepare a yacht and supplies. Yes, a yacht. From Cherry Grove to Blackthorn, there were 3 routes, 2 by land, 1 by water. One land route was a long detour, the other was narrow and difficult. So the sea route was undoubtedly the best choice. Besides, Leaf wanted to do some fishing along the way. Thank you for the trouble, Will nodded and stood up to go find Florigato. Since evolving, she hadn't been as unreasonable as before, but she had picked up other traits, like imitating him. From her posture, to her fighting style, to her habits, she copied him from head to toe. I'll go with you. I'm pretty bored anyway, Leaf said, calling his Blastoise to follow. He was very curious about a Pokémon like Florigato. They walked out of the mansion. Standing on the steps, they could see most of the garden. Florigato was standing in one spot, not moving, her face bright red, as if she were frozen. As Will and Leaf got closer, they saw what was happening. On either side of her stood a Chikorita and a Skiploom. That Chikorita's trainer had an accident. After becoming homeless, it wandered into my yard. The other one is a wild Skiploom, Leaf explained casually. You're quite concerned about them, Will noted. If Leaf didn't care about them, he wouldn't know the Chikorita's story, nor that the Skiploom was wild. He must have had his people investigate them. Florigato made some new friends. Will asked, walking up and tweaking her ear. 2 small flowers, one red and one yellow, were tucked behind her ears. With her habit of imitating him, she would never have put them there herself. They must have been a gift from the Chikorita and Skiploom. This was probably why she was blushing and frozen. Meow. Florigato swatted his hand away. She liked it when he petted her head, but not when other people were watching. It made her look like a child. Chico, the Chikorita, seeing the giant septal approach, quickly hid behind Florigato. The Skiploom, however, just looked dazed. Meow, Florigato glanced at Will and was about to take the flowers off. She felt they made her look too delicate. Hey, what are you doing? You're a girl. There's nothing wrong with dressing up a bit. Don't copy everything I do, Will said, stopping her. He then pointed to the 2 Pokémon beside her. If you take them off, your friends might get sad. Looking at her, Will felt a bit of a headache. Most Pokémon don't have a strong sense of gender, some species are almost completely sexually monomorphic. Unless you deliberately check, you can only roughly judge by subtle interests and behaviors. For example, Ash's Dragonite was gentle and loved to hug, but was male. His Apom was mischievous but loved to perform, and was female. But his Torkoal and Gligar were also crybabies, and they were male. Florigato didn't have a clear concept of herself as a girl. By constantly imitating Will, she had become a bit of a tomboy. Will was genuinely afraid that one day, she might fall for a female Pokémon. He still wanted to experience the feeling of being a grandpa one day. Meow, Florigato looked at the Chikorita and Skiploom, then lowered her paws. She still didn't want to wear the flowers, but she didn't want to hurt her new little sister's feelings either. Haha, if you hadn't said anything, I wouldn't have even known the cat was a little girl. She's got such a difficult personality, Leaf laughed. Be careful she doesn't scratch you. Florigato is very smart. She can probably understand what you're saying, Will warned. Chapter 142, The Relentless Grind of Time. Compared to how she is now, Will still preferred Sprigatito's old personality. Although she was mischievous, she was also straightforward and never hid her feelings, which was very cute. It was back then that Will truly felt like he was raising a daughter. And now, it was as if she had gone from being a baby to a teenager. Florigato had learned to hide her true feelings and personality from him. The childish behaviors from her kittenhood were now almost completely gone. But this couldn't be helped. Pokémon grow up fast, and the special training Will had put her through had only accelerated the process. Will had been mentally prepared for this and could accept it. Unless you used an Everstone, it was only a matter of time before most Pokémon evolved from their first stage. Moreover, Will had sensed that Sprigatito herself had wanted to evolve. Although he didn't know the reason for her desire, as her master and father figure, he had of course given her his full support. The strange thing was, the moment she evolved into Florigato, that intense desire to evolve seemed to have weakened considerably, which puzzled him. Will told Florigato they would be leaving in the morning, then moved to the side. He could see that with him around, she seemed a bit reserved, like a child playing with friends when their parent is watching. Leaf called for his Gyarados carriage. Come on, I'll take you for a tour of Cherry Grove. This is your first time here, right? He said, and then led Will and his Blastoise outside. Will didn't say anything. With Blastoise here, he couldn't speak freely. If he said he'd been here before, Blastoise would translate for Leaf, and he'd have to make up another story. It was better to just go along with it. Pull back the curtain and take a sniff. This is Cherry Grove's greatest feature, Leaf said, pointing to the carriage window. Will pulled the curtain aside. The scent of flowers rushed in, instantly filling his nose with all sorts of sweet aromas. And in that moment, he saw many bug-type Pokémon on the city streets outside. Cherry Grove has been famous in Johto since ancient times for its flower fragrance and sea breeze. When the moist sea air mixes with the scent of the flowers, it makes it even stronger, Leaf said with a grin, clearly proud of his hometown. But Will had heard all of this from Liz 1,000 years ago. Well, it's because of these flowers that the city attracts a lot of wild bug and grass-type Pokémon. Add to that the fact that it's a coastal city, and you'll find that water, grass, and bug-type trainers are very common here, Leaf said, patting his Blastoise. He gave a thumbs up. But in my opinion, water-type Pokémon are the most charming of all. You really don't mince words, do you? Will said with a grin, resting his chin on his hand and looking out the window. He realized that Leaf, while not a bad person, was very blunt. He just said whatever came to mind. First, he had called Florigato's personality difficult right to her face, and now he was praising water types in front of a grass type. His behavior was just like Shooties from the anime. If it were any other grass-type Pokémon, and they could understand what Leaf was saying, they would probably be a little offended. But Will didn't mind at all. After all, his soul was essentially that of a human, a trainer. Every trainer has their favorite type, there was nothing wrong with that. By the way, why are you coming with us to Blackthorn City? Will asked. It was a long journey. The distance was more than double that of the old trip from the Dragonite capital to Jubilance town. Back then, it would have taken half a month by carriage. Now, although technology had advanced and they had a yacht, the terrain of Johto had changed so much that there was no longer a direct route. They would have to take a detour that was twice as long. Will estimated it would take at least a week. A young master like Leaf could have just stayed at home, there was no need for him to suffer through this. I was afraid you'd get lost again. Besides, I've invested in building a Pokémon kindergarten in Blackthorn, and I was planning to go and check on it anyway, Leaf replied. I see, Will nodded. It seemed Leaf was really traumatized by their month-long disappearance. Leaf took Will on a tour that lasted until evening. The scale of the modern Cherry Grove city was truly massive. The Gyarados pulled the carriage for a whole afternoon, and they still hadn't circled the entire city. And the most amazing thing was, no matter where they went, they could smell the city's floral fragrance. After just one afternoon, Will felt the sweet scent had clung to him and probably wouldn't fade for several days. Planting flowers and trees was something every household in Cherry Grove did. They returned to the mansion and rested for a night. The next morning, they set off decisively. The trip would consist of Will, Florigato, Leaf, Blastoise, and 2 sailors to rotate shifts on the yacht. Leaf led them to the west coast of the city, where Will saw the yacht. It was different from Tom's. Tom's was a speedboat, designed to carry people back and forth. It was faster and larger. Leaf's was a fishing yacht. It was smaller, able to navigate rivers stably, and much quieter, so as not to scare away the fish. The trade-off was that it was much slower, which was why he had hired 2 sailors, so they could travel day and night. Let's go, Leaf said, hopping on board. They set off, heading south from the west coast, planning to follow the southern coast of Johto until they reached a river that led directly to Blackthorn City. 7 or 8 days passed in a flash. There wasn't much to do on the boat. Leaf was completely absorbed in fishing, though he rarely caught anything. Florigato, on the other hand, grew more and more restless with each passing day of boredom, her fur often bristling for no reason. Even so, she still maintained an appearance of being calm and composed on the surface. To help her calm down, Will decided to start teaching her some simple moves. As they reached the middle of the river segment of their journey, the yacht deliberately slowed down. Septal, look. That's the direction of MT Silver, Leaf said, running to Will's side and pointing at a small mountain in the distance. A question mark appeared over Will's head. He had been to MT Silver, it wasn't that small. Not that one, further beyond it's blocked by this hill, Leaf quickly explained. There used to be a road here that went straight to the southern foot of MT Silver, but it was blocked for some reason. Oh, Will nodded, feeling a little emotional as he looked at the small mountain. In the past, the banks of this river had not been high mountains, but lush, endless plains. Now, it had become so crowded. That MT Silver is an incredible place. The Kanto and Johto League is on the Indigo Plateau there. They say it used to be the habitat of the Dragonite from the Dragonite clan, but later a great silver bird slapped it from across the sky, and it became the plateau it is today, Leaf said, shaking his head. That's what the League records say, anyway. I don't believe it. How could a Pokémon be that powerful? Impossible. I hope you never have to find out how powerful they are, Will smiled. He knew that with the power of a legendary Pokémon, such a thing was indeed possible. It was just that when those creatures revealed their true strength, the world was usually in for a disaster. The only thing that puzzled him was, why would Lugia randomly attack MT Silver? As for what MT Silver is like now, no one really knows. The Pokémon League forbids ordinary people from going up there, Leaf continued. And in the other direction, that's where the old Dragonite capital used to be. Time is a scary thing. The first kingdom on the Johto continent, just gone without a trace, Leaf said, turning and pointing to another mountain range, sighing. Will didn't turn around, just glanced over his shoulder. It was a barren, treeless land. He only looked for a second before turning back. Not interested? Let's go then, Leaf said, looking at him strangely. He felt that the Sceptle's expression had just become very odd. He couldn't quite describe the feeling, but he had never seen it before. The yacht sped up, heading north. The Sceptle couldn't help but glance back one last time. In the long river of history, how many secrets and truths have been buried by time, and how many can truly understand everything that has happened in the past? Chapter 143, Sunshine Kindergarten. Blackthorn City is a quiet city nestled among the mountains, surrounded on all sides. Only a narrow wooden bridge crossing a river provides access to the outside world. In the games, no matter how much time passes, this place always seems like a small, secluded village, barren and with few people. But in the anime, it was a different story. Because of the Dragon-type gym and its powerful leader, Claire, the Blackthorn City of the anime was quite lively, with no shortage of trainers and Pokémon on its streets. But that was 200 years in the future. The Blackthorn of today, while not as destitute as in the games, was not very prosperous either. It was a large town, a little better than Azalea, but not quite at the level of a city. On the southernmost side of Blackthorn, near the river, was a small port for outside travelers. You two can take the yacht back. I'll be staying here for a month or two, Leaf said to the two sailors, then led Will and Florigato away. As a rich kid, Leaf had traveled a fair bit in his youth. He had been all over Johto and even the neighboring Kanto region, so he was no stranger to Blackthorn City. As you can see, Blackthorn's development isn't particularly fast. The reason it's called a city is because what you see isn't its true foundation, Leaf said, eager to show off his knowledge in a new place. In short, he wanted to show off for Will. But Will didn't mind. He could actually learn some interesting things from him. It's called a city mainly because the members of the Dragonite clan live here in seclusion. You probably don't have a concept of them, but basically, they're a very powerful and ancient people, Leaf said with a wave of his hand. He hailed a cargo carriage from the side of the road. With Blastoise and Sceptile being so large, this was their only option. He negotiated with the driver for a moment. The driver, who had been annoyed at being stopped, was all smiles 2 minutes later, bowing and inviting them aboard. He even thoughtfully tossed all the cargo off the cart to clear a space. On the cart, Leaf continued his explanation. This city was carved out of the wilderness a few hundred years ago by the Dragonite clan and their Dragonite. They chose this place because it's surrounded by mountains, far from the chaos of war. Even during the most turbulent period in Johto 100 years ago, not a single life was lost in Blackthorn. Nowadays, the Dragonite clan has moved to the other side of the mountain, to a small village. The original city was given to the League to manage. The League, in turn, designated that plain as the clan's private territory and declared Blackthorn an official city. Leaf chattered on. He loved talking about these things with Will. He felt this Sceptile was different from other Pokémon. He seemed to understand every word, every sentence. It was completely different from talking to his Blastoise, who, while understanding his words, didn't always grasp their deeper meaning. By the way, what's your business in Blackthorn? If you need help, just say the word. I know this place very well, Leaf said, looking at Will enthusiastically. The journey from Cherry Grove had taken about 10 days. In that time, he had come to regard the quiet, patient Grovel as a friend. I want to go over there, Will said, pointing a hand to the north. He could feel the surging dragon-type energy behind the mountain. That had to be the Dragonite clan's homeland. The Dragonite clan? You want to go there? Leaf frowned, a troubled look on his face. What's wrong? Is it difficult? Will asked. In all the time they had been traveling, he had never seen such an expression on Leaf's face. Any other problem, he would have just thrown money at it. The people who live in the Dragonite homeland are very xenophobic. And since it's a private territory recognized by the League, outsiders aren't allowed to just barge in, Leaf explained, crossing his arms as he planned his next move. The Dragonite clan originally established this place to cut off contact with the outside world. They don't like outsiders visiting. Is there no way at all? Will was surprised. The Dragonite clan of the past had been so open, welcoming all tribes. In the north of Blackthorn City, there's a place called the Dragon's Den. That's the only way for outsiders to get in. The requirement is that you have to defeat the Dragon Elder who guards it. Will was dumbfounded. Was this a joke? He was a Dragon Elder. How could any ordinary person beat him? This was clearly their way of telling everyone to stay out. Don't worry, it's not hopeless. We'll just have to try something, Leaf said. I know a few of the younger members of the clan. Maybe I can get them to escort you in. The rules don't allow outsiders, but a wild Pokémon should be fine. The carriage gradually came to a stop. Leaf led them to a large, double iron gate. On the other side of the gate and its high fence was a miniature ecosystem, a lawn, a pond, flower beds, a small grove of trees, a rock garden. It was a place that could satisfy the needs of most Pokémon. This is the Pokémon kindergarten I built in Blackthorn. It's called the Sunshine Kindergarten, Leaf said, pressing a button on the gate. We're building kindergartens like this in all the major cities in Kanto and Johto. The place was on the very edge of the city, built against the mountain, where there were few people. It was indeed a suitable place for young Pokémon to grow. Meow. Florigato, who had been silent, suddenly tugged on Will's arm, pointing to the other side of the fence. In a small tree, a Trico was sitting on a branch, staring into space. Florigato looked at the Trico, then slowly turned her head to look at her own septal. Her eyes went wide, as if she had just had a shocking realization. Smack! What are you thinking about? Will said, tapping her on the head. Meow. Florigato rubbed her head, asking Will why she didn't look like him. You weren't born from me, so of course you don't look like me. An expression of disbelief appeared on Florigato's face, as if her parents had just told her she was adopted. You're only just realizing this now? Please, look at yourself, then look at me. Do we look alike at all? Will shook his head helplessly. He had thought she already knew. After all, he had asked his Golbat in his past life, and it had said it knew from the moment it was born. But more importantly, the septal line and the Meowscarada line were not in the same egg group. They couldn't possibly have an egg together. Meow. Florigato looked dejected. She had always thought Will was her real parent. But now, looking at the Trico on the other side of the fence, even it looked more like him than she did. Haha, Will couldn't help but laugh. He bent down and picked her up. Meow. Florigato was surprised, and a little embarrassed. She now saw herself as a grown-up and was embarrassed to be held like this. Don't worry. Even if you're not my biological daughter, I'm raising you like you are. And you're much cuter than that other Trico, Will said, scratching her little ears. Meow. Florigato blushed and proudly turned her head, all her previous dejection gone. Come on down. There are lots of little friends in here. You can play with them, Will said, putting her back on the ground. He looked inside the fence. There were indeed many Pokémon in their infant and first stages. But they all looked a little strange. Take that Trico, for example. The white of one of its eyes was green, which actually looked quite cool. After a while, an old woman of about 60 came walking over from inside the park. Young master, she said, opening the gate and greeting Leaf. The Sunshine Kindergarten isn't an ordinary place, Leaf explained as he led them inside. There's a reason it's called a kindergarten and not a daycare. He pointed to a rock wall. An Illicid had the plugs on its head stuck into the rock. Weeby, it cried, its arms windmilling as the electricity it generated flowed into the rock. That Illicid was born in a thunderstone mine and has too much electric energy in its body. It often discharges uncontrollably, hurting innocent people and Pokémon. Before it can control its power, I'm letting it stay here. At least in the rock cave, it won't hurt anyone, Leaf explained, then pointed to the other Pokémon. Basically, all the children in this kindergarten are problem children with some kind of physical issue. That Illicid isn't a problem child. It's a genius, Will said, looking at it. Stronger electric energy meant stronger electric moves. He remembered Ash's Pikachu getting overcharged and wiping the floor with Watson's entire team. This illithid had incredible potential. After the children get better, if they want to be with humans, I help them find a place in the Pokémon League. If not, I send them back to where they came from. You're doing a good thing, Will said, giving Leaf a thumbs up. Haha, well, it's good for us too, Leaf said. This kindergarten cost a lot of money. Even with a heart full of passion, I can't just throw away my father's hard-earned money. What's the benefit? My family helps the League by relieving some of their pressure and providing a source of battle-ready Pokémon. In return, the League gives my father some conveniences, like relaxing the import-export quotas at the customs office, and helping us contact business partners in distant regions. I see, Will nodded. He didn't think this was some dark, backroom deal. The rules should be flexible for those who contribute. Chapter 144, Enemies Meet on a Narrow Path. I've already contacted my friend, but he's currently traveling in the Sinnoh region. He said he'll have his younger cousin come and get you in. Leaf's words put Will's mind at ease. If his friend had said so, then it meant it could be done. Thank you. Before his cousin gets here, you and the cat can stay here. As it happens, there's a problem I'd like to ask your opinion on, Leaf said, remembering something and beckoning for Will to follow him. They made their way to a small grove of trees within the park. Florigato followed beside Will, her eyes curiously darting between the Pokémon she saw, though her gaze lingered on the Trico in the tree. Because of Will, she couldn't help but be interested in it. Septal, look at this Trico. Do you think evolution can solve its eye problem? Leaf asked, pointing up at it. Why would you think I would know that? Will asked, scratching his head. Sometimes, Pokémon don't even understand their own conditions, let alone those of another individual. Although he was a Septal, it was impossible for him to know the answer to a question like this. If you really wanted to know, you'd just have to evolve it and see. He had certainly never seen a case like this in the games. Other Trico were either shiny or not. This one was only shiny in one eye. According to our Pokémon doctor's speculation, this situation might be because its father was a Goodra from the Kalos region. That Goodra's eyes were a greenish-blue, Leaf said, patting the tree trunk and calling upwards, Trico look. It's your evolved form. Trico. Hearing Leaf's call, the Trico snapped out of its daze. It looked down, its gaze falling on Will, and its eyes instantly lit up. It climbed down from the tree but didn't approach, instead hiding half its body behind the trunk and cautiously peeking out at him. Will quietly looked down and met its gaze. He really had no idea how a Septal was supposed to interact with a Trico. After all, since his transmigration, this was his first time seeing one. And there had never been a scene in the anime where a Septal and a Trico interacted. Meow, at this moment, Florigato made a move. She reached out a paw and took Will's hand. She definitely would have been too embarrassed to do something like this in the past. Will raised an eyebrow and looked down at her. She felt his gaze but didn't look back, just continuing to stare at the Trico behind the tree. Trico. The Trico looked at Florigato, a hint of confusion in its eyes. It seemed to be wondering why a Septal would be hanging around with a cat Pokémon. Come on, Trico, don't be so shy, Leaf said, walking over and picking up the Trico from behind the tree. Because of its eye, this kid has had to endure a lot of strange looks. So its personality has become a bit timid and introverted. I see, Will nodded. He understood this feeling well. Just think of how many people had crowded around him and Florigato when they first arrived in Cherry Grove. Trico, the Trico said, now held in front of Will. It looked up at him, its eyes full of longing and admiration. The Septal clan and the Gliscor clan actually had a little in common. The king was a true king. Both a Septal and a Gliscor held absolute ruling status in their clans, and no one could defy their orders. But the difference was that the Gligar obeyed their instincts and feared the Gliscor's strength, but they weren't necessarily truly loyal. If two alphas fought, the members of the losing clan would immediately submit to the stronger one. But the Septal clan had something more. While the Trico and Grovel revered the Septal out of instinct, they also developed new, personal emotions, such as admiration, longing, and respect. This emotion transcended the limits of their genes and eventually gave birth to loyalty. At this moment, the look in the Trico's eyes was not just reverence. It was a desire to follow him. In the future, do you plan to return to the wild, or follow a human? Will asked, stroking the Trico's head. Although he had never been in a wild Trico clan, he guessed that a Pokémon with a mutation like this probably wouldn't have a very good life. It wouldn't be abandoned, but it would always be treated differently. Pokémon don't understand things like being shiny. They don't know if such a mutation is a disease, or if it could be contagious. Never mind physical differences, even a Pokémon with the same appearance but different behavior would be ostracized by its own kind. This was a fate that many unique Pokémon faced. If they weren't bullied, that was already considered a good outcome. The most famous case was Team Rocket's Meowth. He had learned to walk on two legs and speak human language for a female Meowth, only to be called a freak by her in return. Trico. Hearing Will's question, the Trico was at a loss. It had never thought about leaving the Sunshine Kindergarten. It felt that this place was very good. It didn't have to worry about food or shelter, and it had friends who didn't mind its eye. It didn't want to leave. But that was impossible. As a Pokémon evolves and gets stronger, its upkeep becomes more and more expensive. This little grove might be enough for a Trico, but for a Grovel, it would be a crowded doghouse. And for a Sceptile, it would be a toilet. To upgrade this environment, the kindergarten would have to expand its territory or take resources from other Pokémon. Leaf wasn't running a charity, his family were merchants at their core. He couldn't possibly keep the Trico here until it died of old age, unless it never evolved. So, go to the League, or go back to the wild? This was a question the Trico had to consider. Trico. The little one looked up, asking if it could go with Will. It had seen an alpha in its old clan, but it felt that Will was much stronger and cooler. From the moment it had seen him, it had felt an instinctive desire to be close to him. If it had to choose, it wanted to leave with Will. Meow. Florigato, before Will could even speak, rejected the idea. Well, I've already got one little tag along, and that's enough. So I can't take you with me, Will said, not scolding Florigato for her outburst. He really didn't intend to take on any more Pokémon. With her around, he was no longer lonely. Meow, Florigato gently patted his thigh. She didn't like being called a tag-along. But this time, she was in a good mood, so a symbolic pat was enough. Trico. If I were you, I would recommend going to the League. Find a trustworthy partner, Will said, pointing a thumb at Leaf. You might even meet a trainer as good as him, or even better. Trico. The Trico looked at Leaf, moved by Will's words, and nodded. It had made its decision. When it grew up, it would go to the League. I'm sure you won't regret it, Will grinned, rubbing its head. Most of the humans in the Pokémon world could be trusted to take care of their own Pokémon. Whoosh! Just then, a strong wind blew from the sky. Will looked up and saw a familiar figure. Meow. Florigato tilted her head, a strange look in her eyes. Isn't that the guy Will beat up? It really was a narrow road for enemies. Hey! Leave. The Pokémon you wanted me to bring, it's not this Sceptile, is it? The newcomer was none other than Jace, the trainer whose Charizard had been so thoroughly thrashed in Cherry Grove. Roared Char. The Charizard, seeing Will, was extremely excited. It shook its tail, knocking its own trainer to the ground, and then came up to Will, puffing out its chest. The meaning was clear, the last battle didn't count, and it wanted a rematch. It's good to be persistent, but you also have to recognize your own strength. You should just save it, Will said, not even looking at the Charizard. If a Charizard wanted to fight him, it had to meet two conditions simultaneously, be at least 5 levels higher than him, and have a competent trainer. At least then, the battle would be a little more interesting and last a little longer. As for whether it could actually win, that was another story. Chapter 145, The Secluded Land of the Dragonite Clan. Leaf looked at Will, then at Jace, and finally at the Charizard. Ah! So you're the one who got crushed by the Sceptile in Cherry Grove. What a coincidence! Leaf said, finally putting the pieces together. He even smacked his right fist into his left palm, as if he were a genius for figuring it out. Jace looked at him, opened his mouth, hesitated, and then closed it again. After all, his older cousin had told him this guy was strong. All right, since we're all acquainted, there's no need for formalities. Your cousin should have told you. Just take the Sceptile and the kitten for a tour of the Dragonite homeland, Leaf said, walking over and patting Jace on the shoulder. I know. Just follow me. But my Charizard can't carry you, so we'll have to walk through the dragon's den, Jace said, lifting his chin. Losing a battle was just losing a battle. He wasn't going to hold a grudge over it. The proud Dragonite clan was above such things. Although Jace didn't use his family name when he was out in the world, the pride of his clan wouldn't allow him to do something so classless. Then let's get going, Leaf said. He walked Will and the others to the kindergarten gate and stopped. I won't see you off any further. Thank you for everything on this journey, Will nodded. He then led Florigato and followed Jace. After they had walked a dozen steps, Leaf's voice called out from behind them again. Septal. If you get bullied, come find me. I'll pick a fight with them, even if they're from the Dragonite clan. His voice wasn't quiet. Jace definitely heard him, but he just scoffed and lifted his chin higher. When the children of the Dragonite clan go out into the world, the one thing they are forbidden from doing is using their family name to bully others. Their clan had been in seclusion for hundreds of years and was only now slowly fading from the world's memory. If they got entangled with the outside world over something like this, the clan member involved would probably never be allowed to leave the homeland again for the rest of their life. It was precisely because of this that most of the clan's children never mentioned their surname when they went out. Some didn't even use Pokémon from the Dragonite line, choosing instead other Pokémon raised by the clan. This custom had continued for 200 or 300 years, and would continue on. Who knows, maybe in the future, some hidden clan members named Claire or Lance might appear. The Dragon's Den was a cave to the north, not far from the Sunshine Kindergarten. With Blackthorn City being so small, it only took them about half an hour to get there. Through the Dragon's Den is the homeland. Just follow me. The elder is very easy to talk to, Jace said, walking into the cave without stopping, tossing a remark over his shoulder. The Dragon's Den was different from an ordinary cave. Instead of a dirt floor, a gently flowing river ran through it. It was likely the same river that flowed through Blackthorn, passing underground here before continuing to the other side. Fortunately, there were places to step, a series of round stone platforms that were just above the water's surface. This was more than enough for them to hop across. For Will and Florigato, who were used to jumping through forests, it was a piece of cake. The Charizard, however, was much clumsier and fell into the water several times. Char. Feeling that it had lost face, the Charizard decided to just wade through the water instead. It wasn't that deep anyway. They continued forward. In the center of the river was a dragon shrine. The elder is inside, Jace said, leaping over to the steps in front of the shrine. He knocked on the door. Elder, it's Jace. Click. The door opened instantly. A short, white-haired old person leaning on a cane walked out. Their hair was so long it almost completely covered their face, making it impossible to tell if they were a man or a woman. At their waist was an ancient-looking pokeball. Step aside, the elder said, pushing Jace away with their cane. The strength in their hand was not that of an old person who needed a cane. A rare sight. A pity he has too many worries in his heart, the elder said, looking at Will before shaking their head and sighing. As for Florigato, they didn't even glance at her. The Dragon Force, the one guarding this place, is no ordinary person, Will thought, suppressing the restless dragon-type energy in his own body. A Septal doesn't have the dragon type, but its Mega Evolution does, and it's in the Dragon Egg group. Besides, Will knew he had felt the feedback from his own dragon genes, a feeling only triggered by an awakened dragon force. And having guided Iris to use her own, he immediately recognized the fully activated power radiating from the Dragon Elder. Elder, I'm taking them inside for a look. Go on, the elder said, turning back into the shrine. Before the door closed, Will saw a statue of a very fat Dragonite inside. Let's go. I told you the elder was easygoing, Jace said with a wave. They continued on and soon emerged on the other side. It was nothing special, just a vast plain surrounded by mountains, with a river running through it. It's almost exactly the same, Will thought, a little dazed as he stepped into the new area. It was so similar to the Dragonite Valley from his past. It was no wonder, if the Dragonite themselves had helped build this place, that they would have modeled it after their old territory. The only difference was that this plain was dotted with small wooden houses where humans lived, each one separated by a dozen or so meters. In the distance, a middle-aged man was tilling a field, and a woman was weaving under the eaves of her house. Children were chasing and playing with Pokémon on the nearby grass. Though it was only separated by a wall of rock, the Dragonite homeland felt like it was several centuries removed from the Blackthorn city outside. Not as prosperous as you imagined, right? Ugh, the older generation just loves this kind of style. It's because of this that all us young people want to run away, Jace said with a helpless sigh. It's very nice, Will said, a sincere praise. He didn't know if it was because his own mentality was no longer young, but he felt the outside world was too restless, the rat race growing more intense by the day. Peace and quiet had become a rare luxury. To be unconcerned with the world was perhaps a rare pursuit in itself. At least here, he felt at peace. By the way, what did you come here for? There's not much to see, Jace said. He had long since grown tired of this place. Just to walk around, Will shook his head. Although his goal for this entire life had been to come here, now that he had arrived, he suddenly didn't know what to do. All right. I'll take you for a stroll. There are only 2 or 3 places in our homeland worth visiting anyway, Jace said, giving him a strange look. He then waved at his Charizard. Charizard, since you're back, go say hello to everyone. Roar. The Charizard roared and flew off eagerly. The last time it had been here, it was just a Charmander. This time, it had returned as a Charizard. It had to go and show off. Along the way, Will saw many Pokémon. And they were of many different species, not just the Dragonite line. There were Charizard, Scyther, Beedrill, Gyarados, Golbat, Gliscor, Zaytu, they were all Pokémon he was familiar with. The appearance of 2 outsiders, Will and Florigato, attracted a lot of attention. Most of the Pokémon here had never even left the homeland. The only way for them to leave was one of 2 ways. 1. To leave forever and never be allowed to return. Bringing an outside trainer back with them was especially forbidden. The other way was to leave with one of the young members of the Dragonite clan on their journey. This was the choice most of them made. After walking for a while, Will saw 10 stone statues in the distance. He recognized 2 of them at a glance. Florigato, Will whispered. Meow. You go and play with the other children for a while. I'll come and get you later, Will said, bending down to stroke her head. Meow. Florigato looked at him for 2 seconds, then obediently nodded. She could feel that his mood was very unsettled. Char. Glee. A Charmander and a Gligar ran over to greet her. Meow, she replied absent-mindedly. She watched as Will walked away alone with Jace. This was the first time she had ever been completely unable to read the look in his eyes. On the other side, Will and Jace arrived in front of the 10 statues. They were arranged in 2 rows. The front row had 5 human statues, 2 women and 3 men. The back row had 5 Pokémon statues, each one standing behind a human. The statue in the very center was the tallest, and it was the only one of a queen wearing a cape. And behind her was a statue of a giant Dragonite. This is the greatest person in the history of our Dragonite clan. The founding queen who unified Johto and Kanto over 1,000 years ago, Lady Liz. And behind her is her best partner, the guardian dragon, Lord Lan, the strongest Dragonite in our history. How about that? Majestic, right? Jace said, turning proudly to look at Will. And then he froze. Hey, why are you crying? Chapter 146, The Unwritten History. Do you like Queen Liz and Lord Lan that much? I don't know where you heard their story, but if they knew, I'm sure they would be smiling in the afterlife, Jace said, patting Will's thigh to comfort him. Will sucked back the tears that had been about to fall. He glanced at Jace but couldn't be bothered to chew him out. Although Jace had ruined the atmosphere, his own sentimentality had faded. He was just a little melancholic. Since you like them so much, I'll tell you more. Sit, Jace said, plopping down and patting the grass beside him. He hadn't thought much of Will before, at most just wanting to defeat him. But now, seeing how much he admired his ancestors, he felt this Sceptile had good taste. He was willing to befriend a Pokémon with good taste. You're going to tell me? Haha, all right. Go on, Will raised an eyebrow and smiled, then settled down to listen. He wanted to hear how his descendant was going to tell his own story. But he was soon mistaken. Because Jace wasn't telling the story Will had personally experienced, but the story of what happened after he had died. Although most people believe that the war between the Dragonite and Land Kingdoms had a profound and absolutely positive impact on the world today, Jace began, when the Dragonite Kingdom fell centuries later, many people began to question it. Did unifying Johto and Kanto actually have any meaning? What do you think? Will was stunned for a long time. He couldn't give a specific answer. He knew almost nothing of what had happened in the 1,000 years since, so he had no way to judge if that war had been meaningful. Of course it did. Jace said, his voice full of passion. No matter what anyone else says, that war benefited the entire land of Johto and Kanto. He looked so agitated that it seemed he had argued with others over this issue before. I once heard someone say that the war was meaningless, because in the end, the land of Johto was still plunged into endless war, and the Dragonite Kingdom disappeared from history, as if it had never existed. The moment he said that, I treated him to a nice, fragrant slap across the face, Jace said, swinging his arm through the air with a grin, as if reliving how satisfying that slap had been. So what if the Dragonite Kingdom is gone? Its contributions to this land have not disappeared. If not for that war, it's impossible to know if Johto and Kanto could be working hand in hand today. Perhaps the Pokémon League would have never even been established on this land. Look at the history of other regions. Humans and Pokémon slaughtered and enslaved each other. In some places, that situation only began to fade 300 or 400 years ago. Now look at our continents. That change began 1,000 years ago. How many fewer humans and Pokémon had to die because of that? Jace spoke for a long time, discussing the significance of that ancient war from every angle. Will listened silently the whole time. The rights and wrongs of history are judged by those who come after. As a participant in that war, it was not appropriate for him to join this discussion. Besides, he truly didn't know the long-term impact of that battle. To put it simply, today, the most populous and powerful region in the world is Kanto. And isn't that because of the 300 years of peace our Dragonite Kingdom created? You call that meaningless? If the battlefield of the Three Kingdoms War hadn't been in Johto, the most powerful region today would be Johto, not Kanto. Jace said, puffing out his chest, a little indignant. He was from Johto, after all, and certainly hoped his home region could surpass its rival. Anyway, never mind that. Let's talk about Lord Lan. You're probably more interested in him, right? No. I'm not interested, Will said, waving his hand. He had no curiosity about how his descendants talked about him. But Jace ignored him and started talking anyway. According to my own great-great-grand-aunt, the woman who stood beside Queen Liz, the second queen of the Dragonite Kingdom, Queen Iris, she said that Lord Lan's strength was, and I quote, unfathomable. Hearing this, Will's toes began to curl. He wanted to dig a 3-bedroom apartment out of the grass and hide in it. He looked up, thinking. He didn't know what the adult Iris was like, but the child Iris could have definitely said something like that. And as for the great naval battle of that war, it was an earth-shattering event. With a single hurricane, Lord Lan sent the entire army of the Land Kingdom, thousands strong, packing back to their homes. Oh! Will jumped up and turned to run. Jace had the nerve to say it, but he didn't have the face to listen. Hey! Where are you going? This is all written in my ancestor's diary. No one else knows this. I don't usually tell people. It's a good thing you don't. Otherwise, I'd jump in this river and drown myself right now, Will thought, turning to see Jace was still chasing him. He sped up, not daring to look back. He just kept his head down, walking away from the statues, not even daring to look ahead. Thump! Suddenly, he ran into something soft and chubby. He looked up. A cream-colored belly. Hey, this is familiar, he thought. Knight. The soft voice sounded as the owner of the belly sat up. It was a Dragonite, over 4 meters tall. This physique was definitely up to the standards of the era of primal beasts. Sorry about that, Will said, looking up at the Dragonite's face. There were fine wrinkles around its eyes. It wasn't obvious, but they were there. For a Dragonite, which has a very long lifespan, to show such signs of age, it must have lived for over 1,000 years. But, in the instant their eyes met, both of them were stunned. Dragonite, you look a bit like a friend I once knew. Your eyes, the Dragonite spoke first. She wasn't angry that Will had run into her. Her voice was gentle and elegant, like that of a veteran language teacher. Is that so? Will's mouth fell open, then he nodded. That was all. He had felt the same thing, and he had immediately guessed her identity. For him, it had only been a year since he had seen her in Dragonite Valley. At that time, she had still been an clingy female Dragonair. Can you chat with me for a while? The more I look at you, the more you look like him, the Dragonite said, tugging on Will's arm. Yes, I can, Will nodded, stunned. He sat down cross-legged. He had never thought he would meet a friend from 1,000 years ago. Although, they hadn't known each other very well. But his heart was truly happy. After being reborn, he had thought he had no friends left in this world. Jace, seeing Will sit down so obediently, rushed over and hugged the Drago Knight. Hey Grandma Drago Knight, sorry about that. He's my friend. Please don't be angry, don't hurt him. Jace thought the Drago Knight was angry that Will had bumped into her. His own Grandma Dragonite's strength was terrifying. Knight, the Drago Knight picked up Jace, rubbed his head, and then set him aside. She then sat down next to Will. The friend you were talking about. He was the one I loved, the Drago Knight said without hesitation. Pokémon can be shy, but they are also brave in expressing their love. In their world, there was no such thing as being a simp or he who loves first, loses first. Was it, that Lord Lan? How did you know? Well, Jace said he was the most handsome Drago Knight 1,000 years ago, so it's normal that you would like him, Will said, wiping his forehead, hoping he wasn't sweating. He really didn't have the face to say strongest. Yes. He was very charming. Just like you. Thank you, Will said, a little embarrassed. To be praised twice like that was a bit much. He once said something to me, the Drago Knight said, looking up at the sky, her eyes clear and pure. The 1,000 years of history seemed to have had no effect on her. What? As long as we're alive, we'll see each other again. The Drago Knight smiled, as if remembering that moment 1,000 years ago. But he's already dead, Will said, his voice low. Give up. You can't wait for him anymore. There was no fate between you. I know. But I don't want to give up, the Drago Knight said, her movements slow, but her head shaking with steady determination. As long as I don't give up, our fate will continue. Perhaps you're right, Will said, taking a deep breath. He would not try to persuade her further. Because, even after 1,000 years, their fate had continued today. Though, only he knew it. And he had no right to persuade her. After all, he himself had not given up on Liz, and was still trying his best to continue his own fate with her. Jace, you can leave now, the Drago Knight said, waving at him. All right, Jace said, looking at Will, then nodded. The backpack behind you, it's a human's, right? The Drago Knight asked, curiously leaning her head to look. Yes. I met a very kind old woman. She gave it to me. There are very important things inside, Will nodded. This bag was very important to him, he basically carried it at all times. Oh, how about I teach you a few moves? Is there anything you'd like to learn? The Drago Knight asked with a smile. Yes, there is. Dragon Tail, Dragon Dance, Dragon Pulse, and Scale Shot, Will said. These were 4 moves he had already mastered in his past life. He just hadn't had enough Dragon-type energy to recall them before. So many? That might take many days to learn. Perhaps. I'm a genius. One day might be enough, Will joked with a grin. Then let me see, shall we? Okay. Will stood up. When he was learning Dragon Tail and Scale Shot, the Drago Knight only had to demonstrate them once, and he had already recalled them. At this, the Drago Knight was only surprised, not shocked. These were basic Dragon-type moves. But then, when Will also learned Dragon Dance and Dragon Pulse in a short time, the Drago Knight was completely stunned. But it wasn't because of his talent. She stared at him for a long time, opening her mouth to speak several times, but ultimately saying nothing. She just quietly looked up at the sun. For the first time, she felt it was so scorching. So hot that it could evaporate the tears in her eyes before they could even fall. How about that? My dragon dance, pretty good, right? Will said, doing a strange dance as he came up to her. In this whole world, only you would do a dragon dance like that. Ha ha ha. The Drago Knight raised a hand and wiped the corner of her eye. She seemed to be so amused by his awkward dance that she had laughed until she cried. Will grinned. Although he didn't think there was anything strange about his dance, seeing her laugh so happily made him feel much better too. By the way, let me take you somewhere. A place Jace can't go. Hey? It's that important? Is it okay to take me? It's okay, the Drago Knight said, certain of it. All right. I'll take you. The Dragonite came over and picked up Will. Such a large septal, yet she lifted him with ease. This was the reason I wanted to come to the Dragonite homeland in the first place, he now remembered. She flew with him to a small flower garden in the furthest corner of the plain. It was sunny and fragrant. It was very quiet. You couldn't see a single human, or even another Pokémon. This is it. Yes. Chapter 147, We had two promises. By the way, do you know where the first queen of the Dragonite clan went in the end? You know? Will asked, looking at the old Dragonite curiously. This was one of the original reasons he had wanted to come here, though he had only just remembered it. I heard it from an old Gliscor Alpha. In her 38th year, the queen left the Dragonite kingdom and headed north, to travel the world, she said. Will's gaze flickered, but he didn't respond. Because he had already guessed it. From the moment he had read Sola's history book, he had guessed. She traveled north on her own 2 feet. In that harsh era, 1,000 years ago, she spent 60 years walking, covering at least 40,000 kilometers, and then walked all the way back here. By that time, she was 98 years old and needed a cane to walk. Will lowered his head. He didn't know what kind of expression was on his face. It probably wasn't a pleasant one. 40,000 kilometers. That was the circumference of the Earth. I heard she set out to fulfill a certain important promise, the old Dragonite added. You should go in and see for yourself. I'll go get a drink of water. Okay, Will nodded gently and stepped into the small flower garden alone. He really needed a moment to himself. Flowers of various colors were interwoven in the garden. Red as fire, yellow as gold, purple as a sunset. The air was filled with their fragrance. It was like a fairy tale. And yet, in this picturesque scene, Will felt that the garden wasn't actually that beautiful. Instead, it exuded an unspeakable sense of desolation. Because in the center of the garden stood 2 tombstones. The inscriptions were worn with age, but Will could still make out the words, Liz and Lan. These were 2 of the very few words in this world that he knew how to read and write, because Liz had held him and taught him, long ago. The 2 names seemed to carry a history sealed by the years, as if telling a story from a distant past. Will turned, remembering the old Dragonite's words, but she was gone. The entire valley seemed empty, leaving only him and these flowers. There was no sound at all. It was utterly silent. He turned back to the 2 tombstones, and his emotions began to stir. 10 years, life and death, a boundless distance. Without thinking, it's unforgettable. In an instant, a tremor went through his chest. Ripples spread through his vision, as if a stone had been gently dropped into a lake. The scene before his eyes began to change. Liz. Will saw Liz walk past him, but she paid him no mind. He reached out to touch her arm, but he watched as his hand passed right through her. An illusion. The time ripple? Am I seeing a scene from 1,000 years ago? He immediately realized what was happening. The power of the ripple, dwelling within the miracle seed, was activating for the first time. But it only allowed his eyes to break free from the shackles of time and capture a few random, fragmented images. He had the privilege of an observer but could not truly step in and make any changes. In his vision, Liz walked to Lan's tombstone. She gently raised a hand, her fingertips tracing the inscription, and then sat down on the grass. The sunlight, filtering through the sparse clouds, fell on the garden, dappling both his and her bodies in light. Her hair now had many streaks of white, and her face was haggard, having lost its former radiance. Will couldn't tell how old she was in this vision. He moved closer and quietly sat down behind her. She slowly opened her mouth to speak, but he couldn't hear. He turned to look at her. Under the fading light of the sun, she looked somewhat sad and lonely. Her pink lips parted and moved slowly. He instinctively leaned his head closer, but still couldn't hear a thing. He tried to read her lips, but the illusion was sometimes clear, sometimes transparent, shrouded in a mist that made it impossible to see. Will pursed his lips, a little unwilling to give up. He mobilized the grass-type energy within him with all his might, a stream full of life and vitality, and poured it towards the source of the ripple in his heart. His senses were gradually amplified, and the power of the time ripple grew stronger. He heard it. I wanted him to be free, to be happy, to live for himself. Liz's voice echoed in his ears. Every word was like a heavy hammer striking his heart. Will turned his head to look at her, his gaze crossing 1,000 years, and landed steadily upon her. This time, his eyes were firm yet serene, as if his once confused life had suddenly found a clear purpose. Liz hugged her knees, pulling the cape tight around her. The sun was hot and warm, but she seemed completely unable to feel it. Will did not hesitate. He got up, walked behind her, knelt down, and wrapped his arms around her ghostly form. "Lan, I miss you again," Liz whispered, as if in a daze, and buried her head in her knees. "I know. Me too," Will replied softly. He knew she couldn't hear him, but he had to respond. In that moment, the emotions in his heart were like a suppressed volcano. They didn't erupt, but they were scorching and torrential. Emotion is an incomparable energy. It may not be obvious in humans, but in Pokémon, it is a different story. The grass-type energy in his body surged, constantly stimulating and strengthening the ripple power in the miracle seed. Will looked at his own hands, which had suddenly begun to glow with a verdant green light, his eyes full of confusion. Suddenly, he saw a single tear fall from Liz's face. He subconsciously reached out to catch it. But the tear passed through the palm of his hand and landed on a small, inconspicuous flower below. Will's gaze paused. He sighed and turned his hand over, gently caressing the flower. But then, an astonishing scene occurred. Liz, as if seeing the small flower, reached out a hand towards it. In that moment, Will and Liz's hands unintentionally overlapped. Liz looked up, stunned. As if sensing something, she subconsciously looked behind her. Will was overjoyed, thinking she could see him. But he quickly understood from her empty eyes. No. She couldn't see him. But she had sensed his presence. "I'm here," Will said, looking at her and breaking into a foolish grin. Liz blinked. Crystal tears fell from her eyes, and a gentle smile appeared on her face in response. Just like 1,000 years ago. Exactly the same. It had never changed. Liz would always show her gentlest smile to Lan. "You remember, don't you? We had 2 promises," Liz said, gradually raising her head, squinting at the boundless clear sky above. "Yes. To always be with you," Will nodded, also looking up. The sun on his side was a little dazzling. "And to travel the world together." As his words fell, the time ripple within his body gradually subsided, as if their promise had been sealed by the power of time, a seal that would never be broken, no matter how much time passed. The illusion before his eyes vanished like a reflection of the moon in the water. But his heart was crystal clear. "By the way, here's something for you." Will took out the ugly, crudely made pokeball from his backpack and placed it gently in front of Liz's tombstone. "I owed you a pokeball in my last life. I'm giving it back to you in this one." He pursed his lips and turned to walk out of the garden. A gentle breeze blew from behind, carrying the fragrance of the flowers, like a slender, soft hand gently pushing his back. Just as he was about to step out, he stopped. "On my way here, I met a friend. I'll never forget something he said. A man's promise must be kept," loud and proud. Outside the flower garden, the old Dragonite had reappeared. She watched as Will walked out of the garden into the bright sunlight, a gentle smile on her face. "It's a nice place, isn't it?" "It's very nice," Will nodded gently, looking back. This garden was like a place that had broken free from the turbulent river of time. No matter how much time passed, it would probably never change. "Have you decided what you are going to do next?" Will turned his head to the north, his mind made up, and he whispered, "I'm going to fulfill 2 important promises." "I wish you a safe journey," the old Dragonite said, watching him and nodding heavily. This was the spirited Dragonite from 1,000 years ago. This was the handsome dragon she had stubbornly loved for nearly a millennium. The Dragonite had lived for a very long time. She knew that there were incredible beings in this world, and incredible powers. And among them, there must be some power that could allow him to come back again. Although the probability was small, it was because of this possibility that she had always stayed in Dragonite Valley, holding on to that small, insignificant feeling, hoping that one day, their fate could continue. "When will you leave?" I'm not in a hurry." "Then can you stay here a little longer? I'd like to chat with you." "Of course." Will nodded vigorously. Whether it was for the fate that had crossed 1,000 years, for helping him recall his moves, or for bringing him to this important place for any of these reasons, he would not refuse her request. "Thank you." "No. I'm the one who should be thanking you." Hee, a simple and happy smile appeared on the old Dragonite's face. The 1,000 years of waiting had definitely not been meaningless. Even if, in the end, Will did not stay by her side, she would not feel it wasn't worth it. There is a saying in human society, I love you, and it has nothing to do with you. This feeling, no matter how much time passed, would never waver. She just wanted to use this time to confirm one thing, if her feelings were worthy of being called love. Chapter 148, A Tactical Test, The Power of an Elite. Time flew by. In the blink of an eye, Will and Florigato had been in the Dragonite homeland for over a month and a half. Ordinarily, outside Pokémon were not allowed to stay for long unless they decided to become a permanent part of the clan. But the old Dragonite matriarch stood above the rules, so such things were meaningless to Will and Florigato. They had settled in for a longer stay, with no definite departure date. On the plains, Florigato was battling a young Dragonair with Will and the old Dragonite standing on the sidelines, coaching. During this time, the two of them had become like the elders of the plain, guiding various Pokémon and the younger generation of the Dragonite clan. Many of the clan's youths had been skeptical at first, but they soon discovered that although Will's level wasn't the highest, he possessed real knowledge, and many of his ideas were even beyond what the Dragonite matriarch could offer. So, they quickly changed their tune. Of course, because Will had his own priorities, most of his time was still spent coaching his own apprentice and daughter, Florigato. But unfortunately, in her battles here, she lost 7 or 8 out of every 10. This wasn't because she was weak, but because Will would only choose opponents for her that were stronger. At least 5 levels higher, with the type advantage. These were the 2 basic criteria. Will analyzed these battles constantly, searching for ways to help her become stronger. He had taught her takedown, agility, thunder punch, and energy ball. Her own level had risen from 25 to 33, and she had naturally learned Worry Seed and Slash. She was not far from evolving. Will was planning to consider their departure time after she had evolved. Florigato never once complained about being tired. Even when she was knocked to the ground and couldn't get up, she would grit her teeth and say nothing. This perseverance even surprised the old Dragonite, who praised Will for raising a good apprentice. Whenever that happened, a proud look would appear on Will's face, as if he were the best master in the world. When Florigato saw that look, she would be both annoyed and amused, but it would always fill her with more motivation. She loved seeing him look proud of her. The battle ended. The loser was Florigato. The Pokémon within the Dragonite clan were no joke, their skill level was very high, especially the Dragonair and Dragonite. Hundreds of years of accumulated knowledge and teaching from their elders had given them all impressive movesets. It's a pity I couldn't teach her any fairy-type moves, Will sighed, looking at the panting Florigato on the ground. She could learn them, but between him and the Dragonite, across their combined knowledge of 15 move types, neither of them knew any fairy-type moves. And looking for a fairy-type tutor in the Dragonite clan was a bit of a joke. Aside from Azatu, who might know Dazzling Gleam, there wasn't a single Pokémon in the entire clan that could master a fairy-type move. She can learn them slowly in the future, the old Dragonite said with a gentle smile. You're right, Will nodded. Why are you in such a hurry to train her? She's still very young, the old Dragonite asked, looking at him strangely. She felt he was being a little too strict. She herself was gentle and patient, and as an elderly female, she sometimes felt the little Florigato was a bit pitiful. Will shook his head and didn't explain. The old Dragonite had never been a parent, so she wouldn't understand. But Will had raised both his Golbat and now Florigato, and he understood deeply. Tomorrow and accidents, you never know which will come first. He might not even meet her again in his next life. Unless he died of old age, he would never let anything happen to her. But once he was gone, how she lived her life would be entirely up to her. To prepare for that possible accident, he wanted her to be as strong as she could be. All right, that's enough training for today. You go get some rest, Will said, walking over to Florigato and carrying her to the side. Are you going to start now? Of course. As a master, I have to lead by example, Will nodded. In the month and a half he had been here, he hadn't just been spending his time on Florigato. Making himself stronger was the most important and reliable path. He glanced at his own status screen and nodded. A month and a half, 4 levels gained. Compared to before, it didn't seem like much, but the higher the level, the slower the progress. This speed was even a little faster than his time as a Dragonair, and back then he'd had Iris's Dragon Force helping him. He was quite satisfied. He had also learned 2 new moves, Rock Tomb and Focus Blast. The latter was a powerful, special-type fighting move, and one of the most suitable for his own stat distribution. Do you want me to spar with you? Yes, please, Will nodded without hesitation. In the past half-month, he had gotten a good sense of the old Dragonite's strength. Although she was old and her power was starting to decline, she was still solidly at an Elite 4 level. He chose her as an opponent because he had only just learned Focus Blast and couldn't control its damage output. He was afraid he might seriously injure another opponent, but with her, he didn't have to worry. With a 30-level gap and a type disadvantage, she could stand there and let him hit her with his strongest grass-type moves and probably not even get a scratch. Will and the Dragonite took their positions. Florigato and the other Dragonair, who had been resting, immediately sat up, their full attention on the upcoming battle. It wasn't just them. The other Pokémon and clan members wandering nearby also rushed over to watch and learn. With a shared glance, the battle began. Boom! Will stomped the ground, and a greyish-yellow energy flowed into the earth. One after another, sharp, giant rocks erupted from the grass. This wasn't to attack her, it was a test of a tactic he had devised. Good, it works, he grinned. A normal rock tomb summons rocks to fall on the target. But Will's version was different. He was using it to imitate a forest environment, creating pillars for him to jump between, allowing him to utilize his natural speed and species advantage, and to forcibly change his direction mid-extreme speed, making his attack paths more unpredictable. Extreme speed. Will's body shot forward, and the moment his feet touched a rock, he pushed off with all his might. Boom! The massive impact shattered the rock, but Will was already a green blur, shooting towards the next one. So fast. I can't see him. I can't see him at all. Is that extreme speed? A Sceptile can learn that. Meow. That Sceptile's extreme speed seems even faster than my Dragonite's. At this speed, not even Grandma Dragonite will know where he's going to attack from. The crowd of onlookers gasped in amazement. In their eyes, they could only barely catch a glimpse of a green shadow in the instant he paused on a rock. But for the old Dragonite, although his speed was beyond her imagination, it was still within her range of sight. So, in truth, his tactic didn't give him much of an advantage against her. However, if his opponent had been a newly evolved Dragonite, it would have been very difficult to react. From the moment he started moving to the moment he appeared in front of her took less than 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, he had crossed more than 20 meters and shattered 4 giant rocks. Whoosh! A powerful, spiraling sound whistled through the air. The crowd turned their heads and only then saw that Will was already holding a golden, spiraling ball of energy and was about to slam it into the Dragonite's chest. Focus Blast! Thump! The old Dragonite simply raised her palm and caught it. She didn't even use a move, and the Focus Blast just fizzled out. You're a little too strong, Will said, his jaw dropping. He watched as a few wisps of grey smoke rose from her palm, then he pulled back his hand, completely baffled. A Dragonite's special defense was high, and it had a 2x resistance to fighting. But he truly hadn't expected it to do 0 damage. It was very powerful, the old Dragonite smiled, encouraging him. She held out her palm for him to see. The Focus Blast had left a faint black mark in the center. Really? Yes. Chapter 149, Logia was seriously injured. Will's performance was a flurry of activity, as fierce as a tiger, but the damage was a paltry 250. However, after a great deal of coaxing from the old Dragonite, he finally accepted that it wasn't because he was too weak, but because she was too strong. After the battle, the two of them sat down to review it. Florigato and the young Dragonair listened quietly from the side. The idea to make the Focus Blast spin was a good one. Was it your own idea? The old Dragonite asked curiously. From her past experience, a LV 40-something Focus Blast shouldn't have been able to hurt her at all. But by making it spin, Will had increased its power, and it had actually managed to scrape her palm. Oh, no. That move was inspired by a human's idea, Will said, shaking his head. The concept came from Naruto's Raise Nan. The difference between humans and Pokémon is their way of thinking. Pokémon mostly use their skills directly, following their instincts. Any special techniques they have are usually learned from observing other things or through simple imitation. But humans are completely different. Since ancient times, they have been a species that excels at developing and creating techniques. The same tools, the same body parts, the same moves, under the divergent thinking of the human brain, the same things can be derived into 1,000 different strategies and skills, each with different functions and uses. Even a trainer like Ash could develop some brilliant tactics that were uniquely his own. This was one of the reasons why, at the same level and species, a trainer's Pokémon was usually stronger than a wild one. Will himself had watched plenty of anime and manga. So, his use of moves was naturally a bit more creative. Oh, a very clever idea. And your use of Rock Tomb, it seems to suit you very well. Yes, it does. In the future, if my reaction time gets a little faster, I might be able to combine extreme speed with agility, Will said with a satisfied nod. Practice had proven that Rock Tomb could indeed help him create a terrain advantage, allowing his species' abilities to shine. Extreme speed combined with a Sceptle's natural agility was an excellent combination. There were very few Pokémon suited for this tactic, and perhaps none who could do it better than the Sceptle line. It was just that his own reaction time couldn't quite keep up yet. Very impressive. More impressive than our old clan chief, the old Dragonite said. Speaking of which, how strong was your old chief? Will asked. Although he had trained with the Alpha Dragonite for a long time, he had never been able to gauge his true strength. A little stronger than I was at my peak, the old Dragonite said, tilting her head in thought. At her peak, she had been a very powerful Dragonite. But there was still a gap between her and the old chief. That's strong. Will's mouth fell open, his eyes full of surprise. Although he had lived 3 lives, he had never met another Elite 4 level Pokémon. But judging by the old Dragonite's status and the respect she commanded, at her peak, she was definitely not weak. She had to have been at least LV 75. That meant the old Dragonite chief was probably at the very top of the Elite 4 tier. And with his Alpha designation, his true combat power might have even entered the champion class. Yes, very strong. But even stronger were the 2 great birds that appeared a few hundred years ago. To this day, many people still worship them as gods. The old Dragonite nodded, her mind drifting back in time. She still felt a lingering fear when she remembered the aftershocks and the sights from that day. That's right. You saying that reminds me. Why did that Lugia attack Dragonite Valley all those years ago? Lugia? You mean that big white bird? The old Dragonite asked, tilting her head. She had never heard the name Lugia before. If he hadn't mentioned the attack on the valley, she wouldn't have known what he was talking about. Yes. That's Lugia. It normally sleeps at the bottom of the ocean trenches. A single flap of its wings can blow away houses and even cause storms that last for months, Will nodded. In this era, besides the other legendary Pokémon themselves, probably no one knew them better than he did. Oh, it was because the Tyranitar started a fight with it. At that time, the Tyranitar was right next to MT Silver. Its attack deflected Lugia's, and it ended up hitting our territory. You've got to be kidding me. How many Pokémon died then? Will was speechless. He had thought Lugia was just picking a fight. There weren't many casualties. The chief blocked the attack and then quickly led everyone away. The plane was only flattened later by the aftershocks of their battle, she said, shaking her head. That's good, Will sighed in relief. He was glad that the residents of Dragonite Valley hadn't been seriously harmed. Otherwise, he would have had to go and find that Lugia and settle the score. The Dragonite chief and his clan had taught him so much and had protected the human Dragonite clan for so long. He couldn't have just stood by. But if that was the case, a difficult battle had been avoided. Then why did the Tyranitar and Lugia fight? The human war at the time was too massive. Lugia and that red bird were trying to stop it, but their attacks stirred up a huge commotion that reached MT Silver. And the Tyranitar got angry. Yes, the old Dragonite nodded. That ruler has a very bad temper. He didn't know what the 2 big birds were trying to do, so he just attacked the closer one, Lugia. And the Tyranitar was killed. Will asked, recalling what he had read in the history books. Yes. The ruler died, Lugia was seriously injured, the humans and Pokémon suffered heavy casualties, and the war ended. Wait. You said Lugia was seriously injured. Will's eyes widened. This was absolutely the most explosive news he had heard since coming to the Pokémon world. He knew these gods quite well, and Lugia was no pushover. In the original setting, it was the god of the sea. In the movie The Power of One, it was the very same. According to its designer, they had had a hard time choosing between water and psychic for its type. They ultimately went with psychic/flying because it was a powerful combination in the early competitive environment. This was how the god of the sea that had no water type was born. Later, with the appearance of Kyogre, Lugia's name as the sea god faded, and it became the god of ocean currents and monsoons. Because of its poor showing in its first movie, its reputation had once been very low, it was almost called the shame of the first-class gods. But thankfully, the Hoopa movie came out and redeemed it, cementing 4 gods and 1 shame. The resident god of the movies, Pikachu, needs no mention. Then there was Team Rocket's Wobbuffet, who reflected an attack from Giratina. Then there was the Rayquaza that even people outside the fandom have heard of. And finally, there was Lugia, whose name was cleared. In that movie, everyone knows that Mega Rayquaza took on 7 other legendaries. But what they don't know is that before Rayquaza showed up, Lugia, while carrying 2 deadweights, Ash and the small Hoopa, held off the rampaging Hoopa Unbound for a long time. Hoopa Unbound got so annoyed that it eventually just sent Lugia back to the sea. In terms of raw offensive power, Lugia might be at the bottom of the first-class gods. But in terms of tankiness, it could definitely compete for first place. Its combined special and physical defenses are over 280, higher than many other legendaries even in their special forms. And most importantly, it has recover. And yet, this super tank of a god, the old Dragonite was telling him that it had been seriously injured by the Alpha Tyranitar of MT Silver? Then there was no question about that Tyranitar's level. It was at least at the peak of the champion tier, and had probably even entered the master class. And with its alpha designation, a Tyranitar like that must have been dozens of meters tall. No wonder one earthquake from it had blocked the entire MT Silver road. Yes. After the Tyranitar fell, the Lugia immediately flew back to the sea with a pained expression. That must be a sign of serious injury, right? It most likely is, Will nodded, still in disbelief. If it weren't for that time, I would never have known that such powerful Pokémon existed in this world. Yet. Will replied, still dazed. Have you seen the 2 big birds since? When I was young, I would occasionally fly around the world. I've seen the red one a few times. It seems to fly around a lot, the old Dragonite said, tapping her head as she tried to remember. Will nodded, not surprised. Ho-oh, its nice nickname is the cameraman, its not so nice one is the wanderer. It just can't sit still. It's always flying around the world, making appearances. But you can't blame it. It doesn't have its own movie. Its subordinates Entei and Raikou do, and Suicune has appeared many times in the anime. Only the boss doesn't have one, so of course it has to fly around. As for Lugia, it seems it has never appeared again. Will thought for a moment, then gave up. Lugia certainly wasn't dead. And it was normal for it to not appear for 600 years. These legendary Pokémon could disappear for thousands of years. Besides, Lugia was a homebody. What are you planning to do next? The old Dragonite asked curiously. I'll train Florigato for a little while longer. When she evolves, I should probably leave, Will said, thinking it was about time to set off. He now roughly knew how to proactively trigger the power of the time ripple. What he had to do next was not complicated, just follow its guidance and fulfill his 2 promises. Oh, the old Dragonite nodded, her face showing neither joy nor sorrow. After all, this was something she had known all along. She just hadn't expected it to come so soon. It felt like they had only just been reunited. Although she wanted to go with him, she knew that was just a thought. She was old now and didn't want to run around anymore. And besides, Will was the one she loved, that was true. But her life was not a one-way street that only led to him. In these long, 1,000 years, she had also made important friends and partners, and the cute juniors in her clan still needed her guidance. Being with him was the best. But she also knew that life doesn't always go as you wish. The world would not revolve around her. It was fine even without him. After all, she had walked this path for 1,000 years. She couldn't leave this place. There were more things here that she needed to cherish and protect. Chapter 150, The Majestic Meowscarada. Florigato had evolved. It had just happened this morning. Even she herself was startled when she woke up, not knowing when it had happened. Based on how she had been feeling, she had thought she wouldn't evolve until the next day. Who would have thought it would happen overnight? Perhaps it had something to do with the dream she had last night. She had dreamed that her strength surpassed Will's, that she had beaten him, stood over him, and laughed while pulling his tail. In the dream, she had been ecstatic. Maybe it was because of that intense, sudden emotional change that her energy had surged, prompting the evolution. Meow. Florigato stood up and turned to look at Will, who was still fast asleep on the grass. She tiptoed to the nearby river and looked down at the water's surface. A new face appeared before her. Meow. Looking at her new form, the fur on her cheeks turned a little pink. Beautiful. Florigato had always been very narcissistic. You could see it even when she was a SPRI gatito, the little one always thought she was the cutest in the world. And now, she felt she was the most beautiful. And more importantly, she had the feeling of an adult. When she stood by Will's side from now on, she wouldn't be treated like a child anymore, right? Meow. She tried to recall the name Will had mentioned. She should now be called Meowscarada. The Meowscarada stood up straight and looked down at herself. She felt so tall now, her perspective was completely different. Meow. She looked curiously at the snoring Will on the ground. She didn't know how much of a height difference there still was between them. She had always wanted to grow taller, to close the gap between her and Will. She slowly approached on stealthy paws and then lay down beside him. Meow. There's still such a long way to go. She was suddenly dejected. Why was there still such a big difference between them? Meow. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. She reached out and smacked the sleeping Will. Even though she had evolved again, her pride was even greater than it had been as a Florigato. Will smacked his lips and groggily opened his eyes. He turned his head. Beside him was a very cool, mature-looking cat. Will shot up, grabbed the cat's face with both hands, and stared. Meow meow meow. Being stared at so intensely by Will, the Meowscarada suddenly felt embarrassed. She batted at him with her claws, then turned away and covered her face with her paws. Not out of shyness, but because she didn't want him to see the corners of her mouth turning up. She didn't want him to know how proud she was feeling. Well, I'll be. A girl changes 18 times by the time she's an adult, and each time for the better. That's no joke, Will said, standing up. Although he was a bit face-blind, he could still tell that his cat was a top-tier beauty. Even from a human perspective, she was delicate and pretty. In the eyes of a Pokémon, she would be a goddess. Meow. Hearing this, the Meowscarada lowered her head and shyly fiddled with her ear. Her personality has become much more honest, Will thought, blinking. This was a good thing. The old Florigato had loved to hide her true feelings. Even if she was happy to be praised, she would pretend not to care at all, probably thinking it was a mature, adult thing to do. But the Meowscarada of now was different. She would frankly accept praise, even if it made her a little shy. But I still think you were cutest when you were little. Your ears and tail were so small, you were so straightforward, and such a little crybaby. It was adorable, Will said, crossing his arms with a sigh of regret. Although she was very beautiful now, as a father, he still preferred when his daughter was a baby. Meow. Meowscarada huffed, turning her head away, not wanting to hear about her dark past. She stood up and looked up at Will. Lying on the ground, the feeling wasn't as clear. Now she realized the height difference between them was even greater than she had imagined. This made her mood sink again. Oh, you're so tall now. You're a majestic Meowscarada, Will said. But in his eyes, it was a different story. His own height was due to unusual circumstances. But her height of 1.8 meters was, in this era, already at the ceiling for her species, especially for a female. Any Meowscarada taller than her would have to be an alpha. Meow. It means you're an adult now, Will said, placing a hand on her head and stroking it gently. Meow. She didn't resist his touch this time, just nodded. As a Florigato, she had always wanted to be an adult. Because she thought that was the only way to close the gap between them. But now it seemed, no matter how big she grew, in his eyes, she would always just be a child. If it were the old Florigato, she might have gotten angry at this realization. But now, she felt it was quite nice. To be doted on by Will like a child forever, it seemed to be a special privilege, a symbol that she was special in his eyes. By the way, this thing on your face. Will gently poked the mask on her face. It was hard, but the texture wasn't plastic, it felt like her own hardened fur from her Florigato stage. Meow. She reached up a paw, grabbed the mask, and pulled it off, revealing her face underneath. Will stumbled back, so shocked he fell to the ground. It wasn't that her face was scary. It was that, in his cognition, this event was horrifying. In Meowscarada's Pokédex description, the mask on its face is actually a type of long, dark green fur, not a real mask. In the fan communities back on his Earth, some artists would try to draw a maskless Meowscarada, which had misled many people into thinking the mask was removable. But according to the Pokédex, for a Meowscarada to remove its mask would be like ripping the fur off its own face. Author's note: this is a secondary setting for this book. See the author's notes for details. Meow. Seeing his reaction, Meowscarada's mood immediately plummeted. A few tears even appeared in her eyes. She thought that in his eyes, her face without the mask was terrifyingly ugly. If that was the case, she would never take this mask off again for the rest of her life. Don't misunderstand, Will quickly got up and explained. Your face under the mask is very cute. It's just that I thought the mask was your fur, that you couldn't take it off. I thought you had ripped your own fur off, so I was scared. He scratched his face, a little embarrassed. He wasn't lying. Without the mask, she was especially cute, much cuter than with it on. Meow. She looked up at him with her big, pink, teary eyes. Really, I'm not lying. You can ask anyone else, Will said, rubbing the fur on her head. It was much longer and thicker than before. Meow. Hearing this, she was finally reassured and nodded. She didn't believe what other people said. But if Will said it, she believed it. You've grown up, so why are you still crying like you were little? Will laughed, wiping away the tears from the corners of her eyes. He didn't dislike crybaby Pokémon. On the contrary, from his human perspective, they were even cuter. It was a sign of a simple personality and delicate emotions. Such Pokémon often formed the strongest bonds with their trainers. Meow. Meowscarada gently turned her head. She didn't cry that easily. It was just that his expression just now had really hurt her feelings. Her self-esteem was very strong, and Will was the most important existence in her heart. She cared most about how he felt about her. All right, get yourself ready. Go say goodbye to your little friends. It's time for us to go, Will said. Meow. Meowscarada nodded. She had been in the Dragonite homeland for over a month and was a little tired of this area. She did indeed want to go out and travel with Will. Besides, she had long been dissatisfied with that old female Dragonite who was always getting close to him. If she were still a little Sprigatito, she would have absolutely gone over and given both of them a few good scratches. But now, she was a reserved older sister. She couldn't do such a thing. Chapter 151, The Fate of a Simp. After Florigato evolved, it caused a huge sensation among her little friends. They all gathered around the new Meowscarada, praising her for how beautiful she was. This made her feel very proud. After all, loving the spotlight was an innate characteristic of her species, as unchangeable as a slowpoke's love for lazing around. And this was with her mask on. Recalling Will's praise, she couldn't even imagine what their expressions would be like if she took it off. They would surely be stunned by her beauty. However, she still didn't take off her mask in front of everyone. Doing so gave her a strange sense of shyness. She didn't want anyone to see that side of her, unless they were someone very, very important. As she was saying her goodbyes, a small incident occurred that greatly annoyed her. A Cacturn had run up and was fawning all over her. Even when she ignored it, or even sternly told it to get lost, the Cacturn wouldn't leave, sticking to her side like a plaster. It was like a shameless, brainless Growlithe. Helpless, Meowscarada could only run to Will for help. Meow. What's wrong? Will, who was chatting with the old Dragonite, was a little surprised to see Meowscarada run and hide behind him. Judging by her behavior as a Florigato, she should never have shown fear, no matter how strong the enemy. What's with her today? But he soon understood, because he saw the Cacturn. The Cacturn belonged to a member of the Dragonite clan who had brought it back from the outside. That person had since married and settled down in the homeland, and the Cacturn, a Pokémon that dislikes moving, had naturally stayed. Half a month ago, the Cacturn's attitude towards the then Florigato had been very cold, like an adult looking down on a little kid. They had even battled once. The Cacturn, relying on its rich battle experience and its type and move pool advantage, had easily won. After that, it had looked down on her even more. But now, it was clear that it had been captivated by the evolved Meowscarada. Not only had her appearance changed dramatically, transforming from a tomboy into an intellectual beauty, but her typing had also changed to grass/dark, the exact same as Cacturn's. This similarity in their energy composition would only amplify her charm in its eyes. Meowscarada gently pushed Will from behind, looking up at him with pitiful eyes. Oh, so you've learned to act spoiled again, Will thought, unmoved. As a SPRI gatito, she had been very good at it. But he hadn't indulged her then, and he certainly wasn't going to now. After evolving into a Florigato, she had been too proud to act that way. He had thought he'd never see it again. Who would have thought that after evolving into a Meowscarada, her personality would become more honest, and she would learn to use her looks to her advantage. Cacturn the Cacturn said, walking up to Will and giving a polite greeting. It was being polite to Will not because of Meowscarada or the old Drago Knight, but purely because Will was strong. It had witnessed his test battle with the matriarch half a month ago. From its perspective, it was no different from a human's, it couldn't even track Will's movements. If it had to fight him, it would lose, 100%. This is your own business. You solve it, Will said, glancing at the Cacturn, then turning to his apprentice and pulling her out from behind him. She had to learn to handle these things on her own, not run to her dad every time she had a problem. Meow. Meowscarada stepped out sullenly and glared at the Cacturn. She then raised a paw and beckoned. The meaning was clear, they would solve this the Pokémon way. A battle first, talk later. Cac, the Cacturn agreed, nodding and stepping back. It had beaten her before, so it was quite confident this time. But times had changed. Half a month had passed, and she was no longer the same Florigato. Her evolution into Meowscarada had brought a qualitative leap in her combat power. First, the type advantage the Cacturn had held was now gone. They were both grass/dark. Cacturn was 2 levels higher, but at this level, that was a tiny gap. Meowscarada's base stats were higher and better distributed, easily making up for it. And a Cacturn was a pure glass cannon, with almost no speed or defense. In essence, it was facing a physical assassin. Everything else would come down to who had the deeper, more advantageous move pool. Meow, Meowscarada grinned, revealing a sharp fang. With a light tap of her foot, the large cat shot forward. The next second, a dozen Meowscarada appeared on the field, charging the Cacturn from all sides. It was a combination of agility and double team, a technique she had learned from Will. Cac. Turn. The Cacturn wasn't high level, but it was well traveled. Seeing this, it didn't panic. Pin missile. It raised its arms, and countless spikes shot out. But a gentle breeze suddenly blew across the battlefield. Pink petals appeared between the many clones and, with lightning speed, shot forward, knocking down every single one of the red spikes. Cac. The Cacturn's eyes widened. It quickly crossed its arms in front of itself, and the spikes on its body suddenly extended outwards by 5 centimeters. Spiky shield. The many clones crashed into the shield and dissipated. The real Meowscarada was on the side, leisurely using honed claws, sharpening its attack and accuracy. The Cacturn lowered its arms, its spikes retracting, ready to attack. But then it noticed, a seemingly ordinary bouquet of flowers was stuck to its chest. The next second, boom! The bouquet suddenly exploded, and countless petals scattered, dealing a critical blow. It grimaced in pain and stumbled back 2 steps. This gave her the opening. 1 step forward, claws raised high. She used the 4x super effective bug-type move U-turn, slashing down on the Cacturn's head. A sound that made one's scalp tingle rang out, and it collapsed to the ground. Cac. The Cacturn shook its head and admitted defeat. He still had the nasty ghost-type move Destiny Bond, but this wasn't a battle that had to be won at all costs. His goal was to win her favor, not to beat her with such a move. Meow, Meowscarada lifted her head proudly, turned, and walked back to Will's side, not even giving the loser a second glance. Not bad, Will said, stroking her head. He then looked at the Cacturn, who was leaving with its head hung in shame. This battle was never in doubt. Meowscarada was just that much stronger. Her signature move, Flower Trick, was insanely powerful, with its 100% crit rate. But her own effort couldn't be denied either. Shall we go? Meow, she nodded. She just wanted to get out of here. Let my clan members take you, the old Drago Knight said, walking over. You plan to head north, right? There is a huge mountain range to the north. It might take you some time to cross it. No. We'll walk, Will shook his head, refusing her kind offer. The reason was simple. Liz had walked the whole way. He had seen it. So, since she had walked, he had to walk too. After all, his promise was to always be by her side. On this road, wherever she had walked, he would walk. All right. Then. No need to see us off, Will said with a grin, stopping her. Goodbye, the old Dragonite nodded, saying no more. Will we meet again? As long as we're alive, we'll see each other again someday. The same conversation from 1,000 years ago. Only this time, the roles were reversed. Will and the old Dragonite looked at each other and smiled. In that moment, he knew that she had recognized him. They had just both been pretending not to know. Will led Meowscarada and headed north. The old Dragonite stood in place, watching his back grow smaller and smaller in the distance, just as 1,000 years ago, that naive female Dragonair had watched that Dragonite's back as he left. It seemed that nothing had changed at all. Chapter 152, The Sinnoh Region. Sinnoh, a name meaning mysterious and profound. This region is ancient, vast, and complex. It could be said that, of all the lands in the Pokémon world, its history is the deepest. Each region has its own specialty. Battling, breeding, and coordinating were born and rose to prominence in Kanto, Johto, and Hone, respectively. Mega Evolution, Z-Moves, Dynamax, and Terastallization each originated in Kalos, Alola, Galar, and Paldea. As for Unova, it is the region with the largest population and the most cities. And Sinnoh's specialty, without a doubt, is its history and legends. The gods of this region, setting aside their combat power, are, in terms of their abilities and lore, at the absolute apex of the Pokémon world. The strongest creator god, Arceus, belongs to this region. League Year 22. More than 2 years had passed since Will's third reincarnation. 2 years ago, he and his Meowscarada had entered the great mountain range that spanned the lands between Sinnoh and the southern continent. After that, they had vanished for 2 years. He had never thought that the old Dragonite's little while would mean 2 years. Although 2 years, whether for a Dragonite or for him now, was not a very long time, just a small segment of a long life for his human soul, it had been a real ordeal. It almost gave him the illusion that he was back in MT Silver, training. If they had been able to walk in a straight line, with their speed, they could have crossed the mountains and reached the Sinnoh region in half a year at most. But you couldn't just cross these mountains. Some of them were truly barren, without a blade of grass. There was nowhere to even get a foothold, forcing them to take detours. And in doing so, they would lose their way. Because Liz didn't know the way either. Will had basically been following her phantom with his Meowscarada, going around in circles in this mountain range. Some places had changed significantly in the 1,000 years. In his eyes, a place might be a cliff or a lake, but Liz's phantom would just walk right through it. At times like that, he would have to spend time finding a new phantom trail. It was only because his and Meowscarada's physiques were strong, and their speed in the forest was fast, that it had only taken them 2 years. The Pokémon of this era were not very competitive. They wouldn't just attack a passing or strange Pokémon. Along the way, not only did they not encounter many bad Pokémon, but they also made many friends who gave them directions and shared food. But 1,000 years ago, in the eyes of many Pokémon, if even a dog passed by their home, they would chase it for 3 blocks. The most common images Will saw of Liz were of her either being carried by a Pokémon or commanding one in battle. He couldn't even imagine how much time and effort it had taken her to cross this same mountain range. When Will and Meowscarada finally walked out of the forest and saw the flat, vast grasslands ahead, they immediately collapsed to the ground. Meow! Meowscarada stared blankly at the long unseen plains and let out a long sigh. She had thought she was going to die in those mountains. Finally, she could see the light of day again. Phew, we're finally out, Will breathed, looking to the side. The phantom of the 1,000-year-old Liz was standing there with them, also staring into the distance. She looked much older now than when she had set out, with dark circles and crow's feet around her eyes, and her complexion was much worse. At this point, she must have been in her 40s. The years in these mountains had been incredibly hard on her. I wonder what the Sinnoh in your eyes was like, Will muttered. He imagined it wouldn't have been too bad. In her time, Sinnoh was probably still called the Hisui region. And the Hisui he had seen in the games had a very beautiful environment, even if some of the Pokémon were a bit aggressive. Meowscarada quickly stood up, full of energy. She was mentally tired, simply because the terrain for the past 2 years had been so monotonous. It was either barren mountains or forests. But other than that, it wasn't much different from her time in Johto. Sometimes, living with different Pokémon and experiencing their daily lives was quite interesting to her. And most importantly, she had Will by her side. When she was bored, she would harass him, annoy him, and make him tell her stories. That would always fill her with energy and make the journey exciting again. But Will was tired. Genuinely tired. The entire Sceptile was haggard. He had to constantly pay attention to Liz's phantom in front, and also keep an eye on his mischievous cat behind him. "Don't rush me. Let me rest," Will said, raising a hand. The phantom of Liz had already set off, but he really needed a break. The phantom was just there, it wasn't going to run away. It didn't matter if he slowed down a bit. Meowscarada shook her head, walked behind Will, and began to knead his shoulders. This dad of hers was so useless. That's the spot," Will hummed comfortably. Her soft paws pressing on his shoulders felt great, and the feeling of her fluffy fur brushing against his skin was very relaxing. These past 2 years, Will had spent most of his time raising the big cat behind him. They had relied on each other to survive, and she had now become his little padded jacket, gentle, considerate, and honest. She had even started to learn how to take care of others, just like he used to. "East, hi," Will said, propping his chin on his hand and looking at Mt Coronet in the distance. He now knew roughly where they were. Mt Coronet was a long mountain range that ran north to south, dividing the land of Sinnoh into 2 regions, east and west. At first glance, the geography was very similar to the combined area of Kanto and Johto to the south. And in reality, it was. Kanto and Johto were originally designed based on a peninsula, while Sinnoh, like Hone, was a full island. Sinnoh was just larger, with more landmass. The west. "Looks like things will be easier for Liz," Will mused, breathing a sigh of relief for her. From a future perspective, the eastern region was much more developed and friendly to humans. But in the past, in the era of Hisui, the situation was the opposite. The Pokémon of the past knew to compete for the more comfortable and fertile eastern region. The humans of that era, the Hisui people, had no ability to fight them for territory. So, they all went to the western region to build their villages, using the harsh natural terrain as a barrier against the beasts. 1,000 years ago, if Liz had traveled through the eastern region, she would have had to fight her way north, barely seeing any other people. But by going west, she would be able to meet many humans. Life would be much more comfortable. She might even get a lot of help and technology from Professor Laventon of Jubilife village. Meow. Meowscarada gave Will a poke with her paw, asking when they were leaving. She hadn't eaten human food in a long time and really wanted to improve her diet. "All right, let's go," Will said, getting up with her help. He activated the power of the ripple. Liz's phantom was already far ahead. She had even looked back once, her eyes full of doting helplessness. He wasn't sure if she was looking at him, or at the other Pokémon she was traveling with. Will glanced at his status screen. In 2 years, his level had reached the peak of his previous life, and his move pool had surpassed it. This speed was actually quite slow, considering the cheat Celebi had given him. But it couldn't be helped. The style of the era and the distribution of Pokémon had limited his leveling speed. Meowscarada was excited to be on a plane again and ran circles around him. She then pounced, hugging his arm. "Looks like you were really cooped up," Will laughed, shaking his head. It had been a long time since he had seen her act like this, like a little girl. "Meow. I don't know. Let's just walk and see," Will shrugged. He didn't know where to go either, because he didn't know which direction Liz would go. "Meow. We should pass through a human town. We can rest there for a few days." Will looked. In the direction Liz was heading, they would pass through the future location of Sanjem town. 1,000 years ago, this town probably didn't exist. Liz likely wouldn't have stopped. But in the future, Sanjem town would be quite famous. It was where Professor Rowan's lab was, and where new trainers got their Pokémon. Dawn had gotten her Piplup from there. Right now, it should just be a small village, maybe even smaller than Azalea town. Even if he and Meowscarada were conspicuous in Sinnoh, they probably wouldn't cause a huge stir in such a small village. Meow. Hearing this, Meowscarada was delighted and started running around on the grass again. Run all you want. After this place, it's another forest. Meow. The cat's ears drooped, her face falling. There's nothing we can do. A large part of Sinnoh is made up of forests. Will shook his head helplessly. He didn't want to go through a forest either. It's fine. Once we get to Sanjem town, we probably won't have to see a forest for a few months. He now had two maps in his head, the Sinnoh map from 100 years in the future, and the Hisui map from who knows how long ago. According to both, once they reached Jubilife, the route north was much easier to travel. Luckily, I found all those flying-type Pokémon for her back then. Aren't they much more useful than dragon types? Will smiled and shook his head, praising his own brilliance. Meow. It's nothing. Let's keep moving. Chapter 153, The Psychic Boy. The future Sanjem town wasn't even a village yet. It was just a small human settlement, Sanjem Camp. A dozen or so wooden houses were built together without any discernible pattern, surrounded by a ring of wooden posts acting as a city wall. The posts were only about 3 meters high, not even tall enough to block Will's view. They probably weren't meant to keep Pokémon out. It's the same in every world, Will said, standing outside the wooden posts and peeking in. Even on the same continent, the development progress between two human settlements could be so vastly different. Sinnoh's most developed city, Jubilife, was the 7th largest in the future Pokémon world. Its current prosperity was probably not much different from cherry groves. But Sanjem Camp, so close to Jubilife, seemed to still be living in the tribal period. Meow. The Meowscarada beside him tilted her head curiously. It's nothing. Just a small human village. There are Pokémon inside, so they probably won't be hostile to us, Will said, shaking his head. They walked around the wooden wall and came to the main entrance. There were no guards. Will and Meowscarada strolled inside. It seemed some kind of entertainment was going on in the small camp. About 20 people were gathered in the central square, watching something. Even when people saw Will and Meowscarada appear, they just gave them a second glance and had no other reaction. This wasn't too strange. After all, there were more Pokémon in this camp than humans, and they were all common Sinnoh species. And judging by their behavior, more than half of them were wild. Meow. Meowscarada was surprised by the humans' reaction. Based on their journey so far, shouldn't humans have a much more exaggerated reaction to seeing them? Like crowding around and chattering non-stop, or pointing strange squares at them that went click-clack. It's about the same as in Azalea Town, Will explained casually. Because they don't get out much, they're used to seeing strange Pokémon, so it's no big deal. They were probably looking because of his large size, not because his species was unfamiliar. However, Will had forgotten that when he was in Azalea Town, Meowscarada was still just a baby who didn't understand anything. So even if he told her it was like Azalea Town, she couldn't understand. As they got closer, they could hear the noisy chirping of several insects from within the crowd. The sounds had no particular meaning. To Will and Meowscarada, it was like human humming, focused on rhythm rather than content. Meow. Meowscarada ran over and lightly hopped onto Will's tail. She then propped her paws on his shoulders to see into the crowd. Several red Pokémon were making the noise. Kricketune, Will said. He was tall enough to see them easily. Kricketune are the musicians of the Pokémon world. They are skilled at combining their cries with their scythe-like arms to create melodic sounds. Each one has the ability to improvise, and the melody changes with its emotions and the individual. Many human musicians study their melodies, trying to find inspiration. A very ancient activity, Will said, losing interest after a couple of glances. It seemed that long ago, human villages would treat their singing competitions as a form of entertainment, like cockfighting. But this sort of thing was only popular in small villages. After all, not much else happened here. In the future, with the popularization of the internet and the rise of battling, contests, and breeding, people probably wouldn't spend their energy on this anymore. Will quickly looked away. But since Meowscarada seemed to want to watch, he didn't turn to leave. Ha! A sigh sounded from beside him. Everyone was engrossed in the concert, but no one except Will had noticed the sound. He turned his head. Standing next to him was a short, ordinary-looking boy with black hair. He was staring at the Kricketune with a look of utter boredom, as if he had lost all will to live. You're a Sceptile from the Hone region, aren't you? The boy asked, noticing Will's sharp gaze. He had recognized his species at a glance. Impressive, Will praised with a grin. This boy was truly impressive. Judging by his clothes, he was a resident of this camp, and he had no pokeballs on him, so he probably wasn't a trainer. Even if he had traveled, he probably hadn't gone far and couldn't have seen many Pokémon. Logically, he shouldn't have known about Sceptile, a Pokémon unique to Hone. This one is, no idea, the boy said, looking at the Meowscarada on Will's tail and shaking his head. If you knew about a Paldean Pokémon too, I'd really be impressed, Will thought, shaking his head. Paldea was in the southern hemisphere, a long way from Sinnoh. Paldea? It's a Pokémon from that far away. The boy asked, giving Meowscarada a few extra looks. Will was dumbfounded, staring at the boy. Oh, hello, Sceptile. My name is Milo. I'm a novice psychic. I can hear your thoughts. I hope I didn't startle you, Milo said, the dead look in his eyes brightening a little. It seemed the arrival of these two foreign Pokémon had sparked some interest in him. Meow. Meowscarada was intrigued. She jumped off Will's tail and stood on the ground, frowning as she studied Milo. Her sense of smell was much more sensitive than Will's. She could smell the scent of a Pokémon on him, a faint but deep-seated scent that would probably cling to him for his entire life. This is the first time I've met a psychic, Will thought, looking at Milo with a new sense of caution. He needed to control his thoughts. He couldn't be thinking about anything he shouldn't, lest Milo realize he was a transmigrator with a cheat ability. I've never met any other psychics besides myself either, Milo said with a shrug. He then pointed to a nearby house. It's pretty boring here. Would you like to come to my place to chat? I'm very interested in seeing the world from a Pokémon's point of view. Let's go, Will said with a nod. He had no interest in the Kricketune concert. In his 2 years in the mountains, he had heard all kinds of Pokémon sing. Meowscarada hugged Will's arm and shook her head. She didn't want to leave. Then you can stay here. I'll come back for you later, Will said, rubbing her head. Meow, meow, she hesitated, then shook her head again, hugging his arm tighter. She decided not to listen to the concert. She wanted to stay with Will. You two have a good relationship. Are you a couple? Milo asked, leading the way and glancing back. No, Will shook his head. Most people in this era didn't know yet, but although a Sceptile and a Meowscarada were both grass types, they couldn't have a child. The two species had reproductive isolation. It's difficult for two species that can't breed to develop love. It's not impossible, but it would require at least one of them to have a special fetish. Take humans, for example. If humans had egg groups, they would undoubtedly be field and human shape. And many of the popular waifu Pokémon, like Gardevoir and Lopunny, belong to these groups. So, a human's attraction to these Pokémon could, arguably, be classified as normal. But a Sceptile and a Meowscarada had no egg groups in common. Them being together, in the eyes of the people now, it might not look strange. But in the eyes of a future Pokémon professor who specialized in egg groups, it would be an unconventional pairing, to say the least. Oh, so you're like father and daughter or brother and sister. Something like that. Even though you're not the same species, you can still be close family. That's one of the most charming things about Pokémon, Milo said. He led them into a small wooden hut. It was simple inside, a bed, a table, and chairs, and a large pile of books. That was it. But this kind of room was probably the norm in this camp. Chapter 154, I Can't See a Future. I learned about Pokémon through these books, Milo said, picking up a thick volume from the floor. Will took it and opened it. He couldn't read the text, but there were some hand-drawn pictures of Pokémon. The books looked quite old. Besides these, I also learn from the Pokémon that wander into the village from the wild. I learn about the outside world from their descriptions. Why don't you go and see it for yourself? Will asked, frowning at Milo. The descriptions from most Pokémon would be vague at best. To truly understand the beauty of this world, you had to see it with your own eyes. That was what he and Liz were doing. For an ordinary person to walk out of this camp and see the outside world, it's just too difficult, Milo said, shaking his head. A complex look was in his eyes, and he said no more. Have you heard of Liz from the Johto region? Of course. That founding queen's fame is immense. The first monarch in human history to rule over 3 regions, who doesn't know her? Oh, it should be 2 regions now, Milo said, grabbing another book. Will didn't even have to look to know that's where he had learned about Liz. Does that book say where she went after she left the Dragonite Kingdom? Who knows? Probably even the Dragonite clan itself doesn't know. She went to travel the world. What? Milo was stunned, his eyes gradually widening. He immediately shook his head. Impossible. Even now, it's not an easy thing for a human to travel the world, especially when crossing the oceans between regions. That's almost no different from the era of primal beasts, let alone 1,000 years ago. I was just in the Dragonite homeland 2 years ago. A Dragonite who has lived for over 1,000 years told me. Will's words completely silenced Milo. After a long moment, he sighed. A great person is a great person. With that kind of courage, no wonder her name has been passed down for 1,000 years. I don't have that kind of courage. The wild is a scary place. Milo shook his head and slumped onto a chair, his whole body slouched over the table like a salted fish. You want to see the world, but you don't dare to set out. Then you'll be imprisoned in this camp for the rest of your life, Will said, shaking his head. He had met so many people with incredible courage since coming to this world. To suddenly meet someone like Milo was a little strange. I know. Of course, I know, Milo said, turning to look out the window. The small log cabin didn't get much light. It was just like his life, he couldn't see the light, and could only hide in this dim but safe little house for the rest of his life. I'm not purely human. What? Hearing this, Will's hands trembled, and the book he was holding fell to the floor. Not purely human. When an ordinary person heard that, they would probably think of one's bloodline. So that's what Will was thinking. Could Milo be the child of a human and a Pokémon? You couldn't blame him for thinking that. In the history of the Pokémon world, there were many recorded cases of humans and Pokémon getting together. In the future, movies about such romances would be very popular. So, in this world, it wasn't strange for humans and Pokémon to marry. As for whether they could have children, it seemed not. There were no historical records of it. Meow. The Meowscarada beside him tilted her head, confused. Don't misunderstand. I was just raised by a Pokémon, Milo said, as if sensing what Will was thinking. You came from Johto, so you must have crossed that giant mountain range, right? Yes, Will nodded. Even if he had 10 more lives, he never wanted to enter that mountain range again. My biological parents traveled north from Johto, trying to cross that mountain range by carriage to start a new life in Sinnoh. But halfway through, their 2 horses were accidentally injured by some Pokémon fighting over territory. All their supplies were destroyed. They could only travel on foot. My parents weren't the lucky ones. They left their lives there, and they also left me, who was only 1 or 2 years old at the time. Milo's eyes were devoid of emotion as he said this. He really didn't have any feelings for his biological parents. At most, a little gratitude that they hadn't abandoned him, even in death. And then I was found by a Mr. Mime. She was the one who raised me. Her cry was Milo, Milo, so I thought my name was Milo, he continued. Later, under her care, I accidentally learned to use psychic powers. Just a little. I can't do anything amazing, but it's enough to communicate with other Pokémon. And then, she abandoned me. Milo looked up and smiled, no negative emotion in his eyes. She didn't abandon me on purpose. I know that. She just felt that I should live with humans, so she left me outside this camp. Do you want to go back to the mountains and live with her? Will asked curiously. He now roughly understood why Milo was so afraid to go outside. Anyone who can learn psychic powers through training is a genius. Their IQ is naturally higher than others. Milo, who had learned it as a teenager, or perhaps even as a child, must have an extremely high IQ. It was probably because of this that the memory of watching his parents die was so crystal clear. As he grew up and thought back on it, it would only feel more terrifying. I don't, Milo shook his head decisively. Why? Will frowned. From the way he spoke, he clearly cared a great deal for the Mr. Mime. Meow, Meowscarada glanced at Milo. Hearing his words, she had already begun to look down on him. To be raised with such care by the Mr. Mime, only to not want to return to her side, no matter how nicely he put it, in her eyes, he was an ungrateful child. I don't want to go back to that mountain, but I want to take her with me to see the outside world. To see the human world, Milo said, smiling, unconcerned by Meowscarada's thoughts. Meow? Meow, she turned to look at him, then nodded in approval. Then why don't you go? I know where she is. But I can't get there alone, Milo shook his head. He got up, walked to the window, and looked outside. Everyone says psychics can see the future. But from here, I can't see a future at all. People who say they can't see a future have actually already seen their only future, Will said, picking up a book from the floor and tossing it to him. It was the biography of Queen Liz. But the future has many variables. If you don't dare to take the first step, then the future you see is the correct one. But if you dare to challenge it, then the future you see might be wrong, Will said, crossing his arms with a grin. What the future becomes depends on fate. But whether you take that first step or not, that depends on you. He had once thought he would never be able to fulfill his promise to Liz. He had even thought about just staying in Evergrande City with Granny Sola. But until he had set foot in that flower garden, he never would have known that the future was so changeable. If he had stayed in Evergrande and wasted the power of the time ripple, that would have been a true failure. Fortunately, he had taken that step. Milo looked down at the book in his hands. On the yellowed cover, the hand-drawn portrait of Liz was blurry, just like her life's work unfathomable. If you're still afraid, then first go find a Pokémon who is willing to walk with you. Trust it, rely on it, and you will gain infinite courage. Meow. Meowscarada pounced to Will's side, hugging his arm and nodding vigorously. Just like Liz and Lan, right? Milo said, a little light returning to his eyes. He held up the book. On the cover, Liz was leaning against a giant Dragonite, who held her gently in its arms. Perhaps it was because of him that she could be so fearless. Right. Chapter 155, Turtwig and Butu. The next morning, Will and Sprigatito were getting ready to leave. Milo, the action taker, as Will now thought of him, had already packed his things and was ready to go. I didn't expect you to be a man of action. Of course. I was afraid if I stayed any longer, I'd back out, Milo grinned. He knew himself well. The desire to find his Mr. Mime had been suddenly ignited, and he didn't want to wait for that fire to go out. What about your house? I'll leave it. When I bring Mr. Mime back, I'll let her see it. You two can stay here as long as you like, Milo said. He then found a book from his pile and tossed it to Will. It was the biography of Queen Liz. I saw you were interested in her. The book's yours. I've already read it 2 or 3 times. A lot of it is probably made up, but it's an interesting story. Milo walked to the door, took a deep breath of the morning air, and for the first time, his eyes were bright. Although the future had become a mystery, at least his world now had a ray of hope. I'm off. I'll be traveling with Mr. Mime in the future. I hope I'll hear stories about you two then, Milo said, turning to look at Will and the still sleeping Meowscarada before heading toward the southern mountains. May your journey be a safe one, Will said with a smile, watching the young man's figure disappear. In a daze, he remembered that before coming to this world, he too had been an energetic young man. But now, he turned and looked at the big cat, who was just starting to wake up, and shook his head. He was already a father. Meowscarada sat up, stretched, and said good morning. Get up. We're leaving. Meow. Of course we're leaving. There's nothing to do here. We might as well travel and see the sights, Will said. Meowscarada pounced on him, rubbing her head against him. All right, how long do you want to stay? Will couldn't handle her. He put her on the ground, took off her mask, and began to comb her fur with the brush from his pack. Meowscarada was a messy sleeper, and the fur on her head was always a mess in the morning. And she was too proud to be seen looking disheveled. So, the job of brushing her fell to Will. Meowscarada held up her paws, her little legs swinging. She held up 6 fingers in total. 6 days. Fine, Will sighed. He could see it now. She never wanted to live in the wild again. She wanted to stay where there were people, where things were lively and interesting. Meow seeing that he agreed, Meowscarada started singing happily, her short tail wagging back and forth, a sweet floral scent wafting from her. Don't move. Don't blame me if I pull your hair. Meow. 6 days passed. The people of Sanjem Camp had finally noticed them. They had thought Milo's house was empty, only to find 2 wild Pokémon had moved in. But by the time they realized it, Will and Meowscarada had already shouldered their packs and were on the road again. The road ahead should be very flat, Will said, recalling the map in his head. The path from Sanjem to Jubilife was a flat grassland with almost nothing to obstruct the view. In the past, in the era of Hisui, this area was called the Obsidian Fieldlands, a wide open space perfect for travel. But after that, the road would become more difficult. Meow. Meowscarada asked if he would carry her. No. I'm tired. Let's just walk. It's not far. Will had no desire to run all the way to Jubilife. There was no need. They weren't in a hurry. He and Liz had once promised to travel the world together, mainly to see its sights. If he just buried his head and rushed, wouldn't that defeat the purpose? The scenery of the Obsidian Fieldlands was beautiful. It was better to just take it slow. Just then, he saw the phantom of Liz, also strolling slowly across the plains, taking in the sights. The scenery really is quite nice. Bonk. Just as Will was stretching and admiring the view, something hard hit him in the tail from behind. He swished his tail and found that the thing seemed to be stuck. He turned his head, and a question mark appeared above it. A turtle with a sapling growing out of its head had bitten down on his tail and was holding on, looking furious. It was the future grass-type starter of the Sinnoh region, Turtwig. Turtwig was no small fry. With the status of a starter, its fame was guaranteed. What's more, Ash's Turtwig had made a spectacular debut, its early performance far outshining the later-to-be star, Chimchar. But it had been ruined by Ash's training. Yes, in Ash's hands, Turtwig had become what fans called cannon fodder, and it was 1000% Ash's fault. It was a clear sign of his incompetence as a trainer at the time. Many fans of that generation said that Paul was absolutely right to call Ash useless. The reason was this: the Turtwig line are Pokémon that abandon speed for tankiness. They are counter-attackers who absorb a hit and then strike back. Ash's Turtwig, when it debuted, was indeed a tough little tank. But Ash had forced it to learn his dodge it style, turning it into a speed-based fighter. As a result, after it evolved into Grotle and Torterra, it completely forgot how to fight. Even after Paul's Torterra tried to teach it, it couldn't learn. And Ash, the blockhead, seeing that his Grotle could barely walk or jump, still insisted on having it use moves like dodge or bite that relied on speed. As a result, the Turtwig line's performance in the anime was terrible, its popularity plummeted, and it was relegated to being a background character, its spotlight completely stolen by Infernape. But that was just Ash's style. He couldn't handle slow tanks. Even his Snorlax was already strong when he caught it and was mostly raised by Professor Oak. If Ash had raised it, he probably would have ruined another one. Wig. The Turtwig hanging from Will's tail yelled, refusing to let go no matter how much he shook it. What do you want? Will asked, a question mark over his head. He was just passing through. Why was it biting him? And besides, Meowscarada was walking in front of him. If it was going to bite someone, it should have bitten her. Meow. Meowscarada walked back and tapped the Turtwig on its shell. Wig. Hey. Will tilted his head, confused. The Turtwig was saying he had stolen its friend. But he hadn't touched any other Pokémon. Beedrill. Just then, Will heard a cry from his own tail. He looked closely. Stuck in the large leaves of his tail was a Beedrill. Turtwig. You still say you didn't? The Turtwig angrily continued to use bite on Will's tail. But its level was clearly not high, because Will couldn't feel a thing. A misunderstanding. Meowscarada, get the Beedrill out of there, Will said, scratching his head in embarrassment. He had been in a good mood and had been swishing his tail back and forth. He hadn't noticed he had swept up the little thing. No wonder the Turtwig was so angry. The main problem was that the Beedrill was just too small. It was probably a newborn, only 10 centimeters tall. The leaves on his own tail were longer than that. Meow meow. Meowscarada couldn't stop laughing. She reached out and gently plucked the little Beedrill from his tail. The Turtwig finally let go and rushed to its friend's side. Beedrill, the Beedrill ran to the Turtwig and nuzzled him with its head. Turtwig, the Turtwig said, comforting it. In this small patch of grassland, the 4 grass-type Pokémon gathered together was a rare sight. After all, 3 of them were future starters from regions that were very far apart. Sorry, I didn't notice, Will said, bending down to pat the Budu's head. He then took out a bright red tangleberry from his backpack and offered it to the little one. The Budu came forward and took a small bite. It thought it was delicious, and its gaze towards Will immediately became much friendlier. All the unpleasantness from before vanished under the magic of a single berry. Meow, Meowscarada took out another one and placed it on the grass in front of the turtwig. Turtwig, the turtwig didn't stand on ceremony and ate it in a few bites. Since Will had already apologized properly, it had no intention of holding a grudge. Turtwig. Yes, we're heading to the next city, Jubilife. Do you live around here? Turtwig, the turtwig shook its head. It and Budu both had a trainer. Their trainer was just having a barbecue by the river nearby, and they were playing in the grass. You walked here? That must have taken several days. Turtwig, the turtwig nodded. But they were just traveling around the Jubilife area for fun, so it didn't matter. While Will was chatting with the turtwig, Budu and Meowscarada were getting along very well. Do. Meow. Meowscarada held the tiny Budu. She sniffed its flower bud, and the Budu sniffed her flower bomb. They were both girls, and they both had organs that could emit a floral scent, so they had a natural affinity. Turtwig, the turtwig chatted with Will and found that this old bro was pretty cool. And most importantly, he looked very strong. Its own tackle and bite had done no damage to him. Hey? Your trainer will be scared. Will paused. The turtwig was inviting him and Meowscarada to have some barbecue with them and then travel to Jubilife City together. Turtwig. The turtwig shook its head vigorously, telling him not to be polite. It knew what its trainer was like. The moment he saw a strong Pokémon, he would be rooted to the spot. It could already predict its trainer's reaction. What does Meowscarada think? Will looked at her. He didn't mind traveling with a human. It might be a good way to learn about the situation in Jubilife. Meow. Meowscarada gave the Budu a kiss, indicating her decision. Then we might have to trouble your trainer for a while. If you can, I'd like to ask him to help us find a place to stay. As payment, I can teach you a few moves and make you stronger, Will offered. Turtwig. Hearing this, the turtwig immediately nodded. Like trainer, like Pokémon. The trainer was obsessed with strong Pokémon, and so was the turtwig. With a super strong grass-type senior like Will to guide it, it would surely get stronger quickly. For that alone, its trainer would not refuse. Turtwig. The turtwig bobbed its head, signaling for them to follow. The 4 Pokémon headed towards the river together. Chapter 156, Wherever she was, he was never far. It was summer, and the sun was bright. When Will saw the 2 humans having a barbecue by the lake, he was a little surprised, because one of them was a beautiful woman with long, golden hair. At first glance, he thought he had run into Cynthia. But then he remembered, in this era, forget Cynthia, even her grandmother hadn't been born yet. Maybe it's her grandmother or great-grandmother, Will mused. If that were the case, things might get interesting. Turtwig called out from a distance. A young man beside the blonde woman turned his head, his gaze immediately falling on the largest of the group, Will. The Budu saw its trainer and quickly ran over, pouncing into the woman's arms. Oh, so they have different trainers, Will thought, realizing his mistake. He had assumed Turtwig and Budu belonged to the same person. Well now, aren't you a clever one, Budu? You went out and made 2 big friends, the woman's voice was magnetic and gentle. She reached out a slender finger and gently stroked the Budu. Do. The Budu nodded proudly, as if it were the most amazing Pokémon in the world. They look like 2 powerful Pokémon. Turtwig, you must be dying to battle them, right? The stern-faced young man asked, looking at his Turtwig with a passionate fire in his eyes. Turtwig, the Turtwig rolled its eyes. It knew its trainer would be like this. Hello. My name is Shigeru Rowan, but everyone just calls me Rowan. Big guy, let's have a red-blooded Pokémon. Smack. Before the young man could finish, the blonde woman smacked him on the back of the head. I'm sorry. This one gets a little carried away when he sees a strong Pokémon or trainer. My name is Celestia, she said, looking apologetically at Will and Meowscarada. Who challenges someone to a battle the moment they meet? It was too rude. Celestia didn't know that over 100 years from now, this would be a common occurrence among battle trainers. It's fine, Will said, giving a calm wave, though his heart was in turmoil. The two people standing before him seemed to have extraordinary identities. In the future, the most authoritative Pokémon professor in the Sinnoh region would be Professor Rowan. And in the Hisui region, centuries or millennia ago, the leader of the Galaxy team in Jubilife village was named Kamadu. His full name was likely Shigeru Kamadu Rowan. This young man was probably his descendant, and Professor Rowan's ancestor. As for the other one, Celestia. The name itself wasn't special. But when connected to two other names, it became extraordinary. Celestia, Cynthia's grandmother, and Cynthia. That, combined with her signature long, straight blonde hair, made it impossible not to see the connection. Meowscarada gave a natural wave of her hand, greeting them. She had no idea and no interest in who these two were. Celestia, what kind of Pokémon are they? I've never seen them, Shigeru asked. You can't even recognize a Beedrill. It's no surprise you can't recognize a Sceptile from Hone or a Meowscarada from Paldea, Celestia said, shaking her head. She knew her childhood friend all too well. He was a simple, straightforward brute who acted on pure passion and was sorely lacking in basic Pokémon knowledge. Whoa! Pokémon from other regions. Are they strong? Shigeru's eyes lit up. I don't know about others, but these two, yes, they're very strong, Celestia said, sizing them up and nodding with certainty. Where's your trainer? I see you have a small bag, you must have one, right? No, Will shook his head decisively. They would likely be traveling together for a while, it wasn't good to lie. Then why are you carrying a bag? Haha, how interesting, Shigeru laughed, looking at the small pack on Will's back. Generally, unless a Pokémon had a particular interest in fashion or its trainer required it, most wouldn't be willing to carry extra things. You're wild Pokémon? Then you must be incredibly strong, Celestia's face showed her shock. If they're wild, that means they came to Sinnoh all on their own, from Hone or Paldea. Do you think they could have made it without being strong? Shigeru was completely stunned. Turtwig and Beedrill then explained Will's request to their trainers. Hey? Of course, that's no problem. Right. Shigeru immediately turned to Celestia, afraid she would refuse. Yes, it's a small matter. It just so happens that Shigeru's family lives in Jubilife City, and I've been staying with them recently, Celestia nodded. That's great. Turtwig. Shigeru picked up his Turtwig and spun around in circles. He's over 20 years old, but he still acts like a child, Celestia sighed, giving him a helpless look. Just then, wisps of black smoke drifted past them, carrying a burnt smell. Oh no! My barbecue! Shigeru's face changed. He dropped Turtwig and ran to his grill. Hee, sorry about that, Celestia said, scratching her head awkwardly. She sighed, come and sit down over here. It'll probably be a while before we can eat. Okay, Will said politely. He followed her to the grass by the river and sat down, his eyes falling on the book in her hands. Turtwig, Meowscarada, and Beedrill ran to the riverbank to drink. Are you interested in this? Can Pokémon even read human writing? Celestia asked, holding up the book. Will grunted. He reached into his own backpack and pulled out a book. It was the biography of Liz that Milo had given him. Oh? You have one too? Celestia was surprised to see the book in his pack. It was a gift, Will explained, though she couldn't understand him. Someone must have given it to you. Although there aren't many copies of this book left, it's quite famous in the Sinnoh region, Celestia said, opening to the first page. There were no words, just a simple hand-drawn illustration, Liz, pressed against a Dragonite's large belly. It was drawn by one of them, Will thought, memories surfacing. The picture was an almost perfect depiction of the moment he had returned to the capital and reunited with Liz. It could only have been drawn by someone who had been there. In the past, when Sinnoh was still called the Hisui region, the relationship between humans and Pokémon was quite hostile. But around the same period, on the southern continents of Kanto and Johto, humans and Pokémon were already able to help each other and develop together, Celestia began to summarize the story. And it was at that time that a queen came from the south. Starting from Jubilife village, she brought about a great change to the land of Hisui. Will was stunned. The content she was describing, 70 to 80% of it was the exact plot that the player was supposed to experience in Pokémon Legends, Arceus. Liz, in the history of 1,000 years ago, had become the player character. After that, the relationship between humans and Pokémon changed dramatically. And Professor Laventon, with her help, made great leaps forward in his Pokémon research, Celestia said, closing the book. No matter how many times she read it, she never got tired of it. I'm very interested in the past, and in the special Pokémon mentioned in this book. I want to find out everything I can about them. That's my dream. Will looked at her. That was not an easy path to walk. Why is he on the cover? Will asked, pointing at the picture of himself. If the book was about Liz's time in history, there shouldn't be anything about him in it. That's Lan. What's wrong? Celestia asked, not understanding his meaning. But then she remembered something else. Speaking of which, Liz and Lan are the ideal for many trainers. Will tilted his head, confused. The ideal? Did they want to leave their names in history like he and Liz had? Although Lan wasn't Liz's husband, wherever her name appears, his is never more than 3 sentences away, Celestia said, stroking the cover with a sigh. This book doesn't actually talk much about Lan's story. But in Liz's own words, he is never absent. It's as if he was always by her side. In the entire book, Liz's name appears 1,314 times. Lan's name also appears 1,314 times. Will couldn't help but turn his head and look north. The phantom of Liz was standing there, as if looking back, searching for something. That bond is something that countless trainers and Pokémon aspire to, Celestia sighed. Anyone can achieve it, Will murmured, looking at her. Sola and Skitty, Tom and Corphish, Gunter and his Slowpoke. In this era, where the strength of a Pokémon was no longer the most important thing, how could a trainer and a Pokémon who had chosen each other ever fail? That bag of yours, it seems very important to you. It's so worn out, but you haven't thrown it away, Celestia said, her gaze shifting to the small pack in his lap. After 2 years of wind and rain, the small cloth bag was tattered. And for a septal as large as him to carry it, it must be very uncomfortable. Will looked down at the bag and stroked it. It was very important. He couldn't throw it away. It seems you also have a cherished experience, Celestia said. Will smiled and nodded. Although their time together had been short, he had indeed made unforgettable and precious memories with those people. When we get back to Jubilife, let me help you repair that bag. You want it to stay with you a little longer, right? Thank you. I'd appreciate that, Will said, looking down at the bag and nodding heavily. Hey, food's ready. Shigeru's voice called out. Everyone gathered to eat. Chapter 157, The Trouble with Being Large. That afternoon, after a full meal, the group rested on the grass. Will, however, was busy, teaching Shigeru and his Turtwig a new move, Energy Ball. It was a relatively high-power, special-type grass move, and it was quite difficult to learn. According to Will's observation, the Turtwig's level was not high, only in the teens. It barely had any grass-type energy in its body, let alone the capacity to learn moves of other types. Therefore, the move he taught it had to be a grass-type one, so as not to hinder its growth. The remaining factor was its battle style. The Turtwig line's stats are distributed to be a physical tank, excelling at standing its ground and fighting with physical moves. The interesting thing is, most physical grass-type moves are close range, and a Turtwig is not fast. This isn't a design flaw in the turn-based games, but in reality, a slow Pokémon with only close-range moves could be defeated before it ever even touched its opponent. So, even though it didn't match its stats, Will chose to teach it the ranged move, Energy Ball. At least it would be able to hit something. Turtwig. At Will's direction, the Turtwig tried again, but unfortunately, it still failed. Come on, Turtwig. You can do it. We'll master it today. Shigeru knelt on the side, cheering with all his might. Don't be in such a rush. Energy Ball isn't a simple move. How could it possibly be learned in one day? It will take at least a week, Celestia said, shaking her head. It was clear she had a better understanding of Pokémon. Whoa! Turtwig, under Will's guidance, tried again, but still failed. Come on, Turtwig. You can do it. We'll master it today. Shigeru knelt on the side, cheering with all his might. Don't be in such a rush. Energy ball isn't a simple move. How could it possibly be learned in one day? It will take at least a week, Celestia said, shaking her head. It was clear she had a better understanding of Pokémon. A Turtwig's intelligence is roughly equivalent to that of a normal human child. Learning a new skill doesn't happen overnight. However, she was impressed with Will's teaching ability. In just a few sentences, the Turtwig had already been able to start practicing. And that Meowscarada. Celestia's gaze shifted to the other side. The Meowscarada was controlling dozens of petals, making them dance in the air, which made the little Budo kick its legs with excitement. Incredible, Celestia marveled. She was familiar with the move Petal Blizzard, her mother's Rosalia knew it. But her mother's Rosalia was her main partner, and her mother was an active duty inspector for the Sinnoh League. And at full power, it could only produce about the same number of petals as this Meowscarada. After their rest, Shigeru and Celestia packed their bags and headed towards Jubilife City. The Obsidian Field lands weren't that large, reaching the city would take 3 days at most. In the third morning, they arrived. This city was huge and had a completely different style from a coastal metropolis like Cherry Grove. Jubilife was the central hub of the Sinnoh region, and its level of development surpassed even Cherry Grove's. You could already see the primitive forms of various electronic devices here. The entire city was cold and dry, a stark contrast to Cherry Grove's humid and cool climate. As a grass type, Will might have preferred Cherry Grove's environment, but personally, he found the dry air more comfortable. He turned his head. Through the power of the time ripple, he could see Liz's phantom. She was standing in place, tapping at the empty air in front of her. She must have arrived at the ancient Jubilife village. From what Celestia had told him, the era Liz had traveled to was exactly the one from the Legends, Arceus game. He now had a rough idea of what she would do next. His memory wasn't perfectly clear, but since she had eventually returned to Johto, it meant she wouldn't be in any real danger here. He had nothing to worry about. One question, however, did puzzle him. Professor Laventon in Hisui had Pokeballs, and he had come from the Galar region. Did that mean Galar had developed them 1,000 years ago? The apricorn craft of Johto had only been born 400 to 600 years ago. Or, was the Johto craft itself a derivative of Laventon's technology? It was hard to say. Follow me. Luckily, my place is on the first floor. Septal, you can go in through the window. The door would be a problem, Shigeru said, looking back at Will. Sorry about that, Will said, scratching his head in embarrassment. He was too tall to fit through human doors. And his own Pokeball had been left in the flower garden in the Dragonite homeland, he couldn't use it to get in and out. Leaving his Pokeball there had its pros and cons. The pro was that no one could control him by stealing his ball. The con was his current situation. He was extremely conspicuous on the street, and getting into human houses was a real hassle. It seems being large isn't always a good thing, Will sighed, feeling the stares of the passers-by. In the era of primal beasts, the advantages of being big far outweighed the disadvantages. It greatly increased a Pokémon's chances of survival. But in this peaceful era of leagues, his large size was more of a hindrance than a help. Besides looking cool, it was useless. Meowscarada, on the other hand, didn't care. In fact, she thought this was normal. After all, she was so beautiful and cute, and Will was so tall and mighty. It was only natural that humans would stare at them. Meow, she stepped lightly on Will's tail and, with a leap, landed on his shoulders. Now they were even more conspicuous. Hey! Are those your Pokémon? How about a battle? A trainer called out, walking up to Shigeru and Celestia. Ah? No. Shigeru was about to explain when Celestia tugged on his arm. Sorry, we're in a hurry, she said with a polite smile, quickly pulling Shigeru away. Why didn't you just tell the truth? He asked once they were on a less crowded street. Are you crazy? If you told them they were wild Pokémon, those people would have gone into a frenzy. Do you think we'd ever have been able to leave? Celestia said, frowning at him. Oh, right, Shigeru nodded, then gave her a thumbs up. You're the smart one. Let's just go, Celestia sighed. If Shigeru's family wasn't so rich, she had no idea how her childhood friend would have survived in this world. The Rowan family, it was true, only produced 2 types of people, cunning, steady geniuses, or righteous, brave, reckless idiots. Shigeru was clearly the latter. They arrived in front of a tall building, which looked like an apartment complex. Shigeru lived on the first floor. Septal, wait by this window. I'll go in and open it for you, he said, leading the others inside first. You can go in and take a look too, Will said to the Meowscarada on his shoulder. Meow, she shook her head decisively. She wasn't in a hurry and would rather wait a few more seconds with him. The window was quickly opened. Meowscarada went in first, and then Will followed. The room ceiling was over 4 meters high, but it still felt a little cramped for him. And the interior doors were too small for him to pass through. This meant he was trapped in this one room. This was Celestia's guest room before. Septal, you and Meowscarada can stay here for now. It'll be easier for you to get in and out, Shigeru said, then left, calling back over his shoulder, let's go out for lunch. I'll show those guys at the training grounds what a really strong Pokémon looks like. Just make yourselves at home. Don't worry if you break something. That guy is richer than you think, Celestia said, giving Will a smile. It seemed that whether it was the Celestia of now or the Cynthia of the future, her gentleness towards Pokémon was the same. Thank you for your trouble, Will nodded politely. Being able to stay indoors was enough. It was a shelter from the wind and rain, but more importantly, it would keep them from being harassed by the people outside. And compared to living in a tree in his first life, and a cave in his second, this small bedroom was a huge improvement. Meow. You don't have to stay here with me. Go and see what a human's house looks like. Meow, Meowscarada nodded and walked out of the room. At 1.8 meters, she was tall but still within the normal human range, so the house did not restrict her movements. Chapter 158, The Kids' Meal. Shigeru and Celestia packed up their things, and the group of 4 Pokémon and 2 humans set off. They were heading to a Pokémon restaurant near the city center. This era was not like the future, where the vast majority of restaurants offered food for both trainers and their Pokémon, allowing them to dine together. In this period, people who knew how to make Pokémon food were still rare, and the profession of Pokémon breeder had not yet been established. So, restaurants that allowed Pokémon inside were few and far between and were given the special title of Pokémon Restaurant. These establishments were incredibly popular among the trainer community. Basically, if there was a Pokémon restaurant available, trainers wouldn't even consider going anywhere else. And right now, almost everyone was a trainer. So, it was clear that these restaurants would soon replace traditional ones and become the new trend in the culinary world. The one they were going to was near the city's training grounds and the Pokémon Hospital, making it the most popular restaurant in Jubilife, bar none. On the way to the city center, Will and Meowscarada watched as the number of Pokémon on the streets grew, the variety becoming dazzling. They occasionally saw Pokémon from Kanto and Johto, but since Sinnoh was relatively close, it wasn't particularly surprising. In terms of sheer aesthetics, Septal and Meowscarada were in a league of their own. Meowscarada, in particular, with her 1.8-meter height and mysterious, alluring mask, was a natural head-turner. Realizing she was the center of attention, she immediately put on a cool and aloof expression, perfectly playing the role of an Ice Queen beauty. Some of the younger Pokémon were staring at her with hearts in their eyes. While there were many battle-focused trainers in the world, the vast majority were just ordinary people. They didn't pursue strength above all else, they cared more about a Pokémon's looks and personality. So, on this street, a Pokémon like Will, who looked super strong, was not as popular as the beautiful Meowscarada. The training grounds were just an ordinary field a few years ago. They say that hundreds of years ago, it was where the residents of Jubilife practiced martial arts. Now it's been converted into a place for trainers, Shigeru explained to Will. That's right. It's a gathering place for battle trainers. Some of the stronger ones hold matches there, Celestia added, then looked at Will curiously. Septal, you'll definitely be challenged when you get there. You'll have to be careful not to overdo it. I know, Will grinned. If he met a Pokémon 3 or 5 levels higher than him, he might be interested in a fight. But that level of opponent was already at the gym leader tier. He didn't think some unemployed gym leader would just be hanging around a public park in this era. As for the rest, they could try to beat his Meowscarada first. Will had no hobby of beating up children. They arrived at the restaurant. From the outside, it looked a bit like the Krusty Krab from Bikini Bottom, but a supersized version. The 2 glass doors alone were 4 or 5 meters wide and 7 or 8 meters high. Meow. Meowscarada stood outside the window, staring inside, completely stunned. There were so many Pokémon. And they all looked so happy. Let's go, Shigeru said, pushing open the door. Inside, a faint sweet and sour aroma wafted through the air. The restaurant clearly specialized in that flavor profile. Long time no see, long ears, Shigeru said, walking up to the counter and greeting the Lapuni waitress. Turtwig bounced up and down. Lapun the Lapuni smiled and waved back, clearly familiar with them. Will gave it a second look. A Lapuni, aside from being fast, wasn't anything special from a battle perspective. But from an aesthetic perspective, it was a popular character in certain online communities. Unfortunately, Will didn't get the appeal, so he quickly looked away. In his opinion, it wasn't even as good as a male Meowscarada or Gardevoir. Lapun. Recommend a few combos for us. We've got some new friends, Shigeru said, pointing to Celestia and the 3 Pokémon behind him. Lapun? Bun, the Lapuni peeked over the counter. She could tell they were all grass types. At this, a voice suddenly sounded. Meow. Meowscarada had come up beside Will. She shyly raised a paw and pointed to a combo on the menu. Does Meowscarada want that one? That's the kid's meal, Shigeru said, scratching his head. He thought the portion size might not be enough for her. Ha ha ha, hearing this, the surrounding trainers couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't mocking, just amusing. Such a large cat, wanting a kid's meal. But the laughter made Meowscarada lower her head in embarrassment, thinking she had done something shameful. You want the prize that comes with it? Will asked, stroking her ear. How could he not understand her? She wasn't interested in the food, she just wanted the little toy. Meow. Meowscarada buried her head in his embrace, her little tail drooping. You idiot, Celestia sighed at Shigeru, then stepped forward. We'll have 4 kids' meals. Bun. The Lapuni nodded, then pointed to several small toys on the menu, asking which 4 they wanted. Meowscarada, Septal, what do you want? Celestia asked, pulling them over to choose. Thank you, I don't need one. Meowscarada, which one do you want? Meow, she shyly pointed at a small Trico toy. Alright, 1 Trico, 1 Budu, 1 Turtwig, and there's no SPR Gatito. Then just give us a random one, Celestia decided quickly. She was nothing like her indecisive descendant, Cynthia. The Lapuni soon returned with a large tray. On it were the 4 toys. The random one turned out to be a Piplup. As a native Sinnoh Pokémon and a future starter, it was normal for it to be a popular choice. Here you go, Will said, taking the Trico and Piplup toys from the tray and giving them to Meowscarada. They were made of wood and looked a little rough, but she loved them. They all started eating at the table. Meowscarada, however, just sat on the side, holding the Trico and Piplup and making them fight. The Piplup was being stomped on by the Trico over and over again, as pitiful as Dawn's Piplup being tormented by Jubilife in the anime. Smack! Will smacked her on the back of the head. Eat your food. Meow! She cried out, wronged. She put the 2 wooden puppets aside and obediently started to eat. She quickly forgot about them, completely immersed in the delicious human-made food. Septal is like Meowscarada's older brother, Celestia commented with a slight smile from across the table. She loved watching these Pokémon interact. They were so simple and cute. I'm her father, and her master, Will replied, putting the 2 forgotten puppets into his backpack. He and Meowscarada were only a week apart in age, so they did look more like siblings. But in terms of temperament and mental age, he was definitely a father figure to her. Meow, Meowscarada swung her little legs, not caring at all. Whether he was her father or her master, he was family. That was all that mattered. Chapter 159, The Captain of the Mining Corps. After lunch, Shigeru eagerly dragged the group towards the training grounds. In reality, only his Turtwig was as excited as he was. The others were all rather unenthusiastic about battling. Celestia and her Beedrill weren't interested. Besides, Beedrill was still too small and didn't have the ability to fight other Pokémon yet. Will, having fought for 3 lifetimes, was tired of it. On a day that was supposed to be for rest, he really couldn't be bothered. As for Meowscarada, she had never been interested in battling in the first place. The only reasons her level was so high were that half of it was because Will had forced her, and the other half was because she wanted to catch up to him. Her only real interests were singing and eating. The training grounds were close to the restaurant, so it took them less than 5 minutes to get there. Oh! Arriving at the edge of the battleground, Will was a little surprised by what he saw. He had assumed that in this era, a battleground would be just like the backyard of a future Pokémon Center, with a few lines drawn in the dirt. But this was actually a bit different. For one, the ground was covered with a lawn. In terms of visual effect, it was much more beautiful than the barren fields of the anime. Around the field, there were even some chairs for spectators, but there weren't many, and they were already full. It's not even peak time yet. In the evening, after the students and office workers get home and have dinner, that's when this place really gets lively, Celestia explained. It wasn't her first time in Jubilife City. So many people, and only one battleground. You could wait all day and not get a turn, Will said, shaking his head. There were still too few battlefields in the cities of this era. But he quickly realized something was wrong. The number of people who were actually keen on battling was not that large. Most were just here to watch the excitement. It was the feeling of not wanting to be at home alone, of coming to a crowded place to dispel the loneliness. What they were actually doing wasn't important. The activity of battling is currently most popular in Kanto and Johto, followed by Sinnoh and the Orange Islands. I'm not sure about the more distant regions. Perhaps Paldea is more popular, Celestia explained the phenomenon. In the southern hemisphere, battling and breeding had originated from the 800-year-old Orange Academy. In the northern hemisphere, they had started in Kanto and Johto, respectively. Sinnoh, being the closest to them, had been quite deeply influenced. Hey! Rowan! You brought 2 incredible Pokémon with you. Hurry up and have a match with me. Shigeru was a celebrity at the training grounds. The moment he appeared, someone called out to him. Will glanced over. It was a girl about the same age as Shigeru. The Pokémon by her leg was a Pachirisu. Don't be fooled by its small size and cute appearance, its role is that of a light tank, and it's quite durable. At the same level, it would be a bit tougher than a Turtwig. But judging by its size, its level was not high. Forget challenging Will, it wasn't even qualified to challenge Meowscarada. The girl's voice, however, had turned everyone's attention to Will and Meowscarada. Meowscarada instantly entered her Ice Queen state, crossing her arms and standing by Will's side, her gaze fixed forward, as if nothing in the world could enter her eyes. Will was even more direct. He glanced at the crowd once and then looked away, putting on the air of a being who had looked down upon the world and found no worthy rival. This wasn't him deliberately acting cool. It was just that among the Pokémon at this training ground, there really wasn't a single one who could fight him. Well? Are you two going to go up? It looks like everyone is very interested in you, Shigeru said, turning to them, his eyes sparkling. He also wanted to see their combat power. Forget it. There are no opponents, Will shook his head. He was a little confused about the power levels of this era's human society. 200 years in the future, there was a clear hierarchy, champion at the top, then the Elite Four, then gym leaders, frontier brains, and so on. But now, there were no such things as champions or Elite Four in the leagues. There was no organized power structure. This made it difficult for him to judge whether his own strength was high or low. But based on the performance of these ordinary trainers, his level should be quite high. How about I be your opponent? A voice called out from outside the training ground. Everyone turned to look and began to murmur. Whoa, that's Gavin from Orebug City. A big shot has arrived. Isn't he the captain of the league's mining corps? What's he doing here? I heard he's an elite among trainers. His Pokémon are as strong as monsters, not on our level at all. Do you think that Sceptile will accept? Will's ears twitched as he listened to the crowd. He turned to look at the newcomer. It was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, wearing a miner's helmet, a white shirt, and grey work pants. Golem, show them what you've got. Let's see if you are worthy of being his opponent, Gavin said, reaching for his waist. A large, rock-covered sphere appeared on the spot. A Golem, the rock/ground-type Pokémon. A normal one is 1.4 meters tall. Gavin's was 2 meters. Its strength was visibly immense. However, using a Golem to fight a Sceptile was a joke. Rock/ground is 4x weak to grass. Golem is a physical tank, but Sceptile is a special attacker. On paper, Golem was at a complete disadvantage. But the current situation was... Will couldn't see the Golem's level. This meant its level was higher than his own. How much higher, he couldn't confirm. He would have to exchange a few blows to get a rough idea. Meow. Meowscarada looked at Will, asking if he needed her to handle this. Forget it. You're not quite there yet, Will shook his head. Believe it or not, although Meowscarada had the stats, moves, and ability that a Septal dreamed of, when it came to fighting a golem, she was actually not as suitable as he was. With that, Will himself walked into the center of the battlefield. His desire to fight wasn't strong, but he and Meowscarada would likely be in Jubilife for a long time. He'd better show off his strength now to make his future days a little quieter. Ooh, is Septal going up? Go for it! Shigeru yelled, extremely excited. The field immediately erupted in cheers. Anyone could tell that an exciting duel was about to begin. I wonder who's stronger, Celestia said, also feeling a rare surge of excitement. Although she wasn't interested in battling herself, watching a good fight was always fun. Of course, in her heart, she still felt that Gavin was stronger. After all, the Orebug mining core belonged to the Sinnoh League. Although captain sounded like a logistics position, that was not the case. During the mining process, they often dug into the homes of underground Pokémon. If they ran into a hot-tempered one, a battle was inevitable. So, the captain of the mining corps was actually a combat commander, and his strength was definitely much greater than that of an ordinary league inspector. And based on her observation of Meowscarada, her strength was about the level of an inspector's main Pokémon. Then the Septal traveling with her was, at most, at the level of an inspector's ace. In that case, compared to Gavin, the captain of the corps, he was still lacking. Chapter 160, Septal vs. Golem. Well then, allow me to go first. Golem, use Stealth Rock. Before Gavin's words had even faded, his golem had already raised its claws, forming a cluster of transparent, sharp rocks in mid-air. Their rapport is high. Much higher than Jace and his Charizard, Will thought, pursing his lips. To be blunt, in all his years in the Pokémon world, Gavin was the one who most resembled a true, future-era trainer. Dig. Will dove into the ground and vanished. A Septal that knows dig. Gavin was stunned. What kind of Septal burrows into the ground? It was common knowledge that Septal loved to run in open spaces or leap around in complex terrain. And most of them had proud, aloof personalities, disdaining the use of dirty tricks. A sneaky move like dig was not something a Septal would normally learn. Gavin had been to the home region and had fought powerful Septal before, but this was the first time he had ever seen one use this move. However, Earthquake. Gavin didn't hesitate for long. As the captain of the mining corps, even in a simple training match, he would go all out. Dazing off during a battle was not something he did. Golem. With a mighty roar, the golem stomped the ground. A shockwave ripped through the training field, and many of the onlookers who weren't steady on their feet were knocked to the ground. But they didn't care about that, they were all looking at the figure that had been blasted out of the earth. Will was thrown from the ground, did a flip in the air, and landed, wiping the dust from his face. Whew! Not bad, he grinned. The golem's level wasn't low, around LV 63, about 8 levels higher than his own. A ground-type move's damage was halved against a grass-type, so the effect wasn't too terrible. As for what he was doing underground? He was setting up, of course. His Dragon Dance and Swords Dance were now fully stacked. His physical attack strength was at its peak. Stone Edge. Seeing Will standing still, Gavin decisively pressed the attack. In the sky, 7 or 8 sharp, yellowish-grey rocks formed and shot towards him. Leaf Storm. Will whipped his tail, and a storm of leaves, wrapped in a visible green energy, converged into a tornado that swept forward, shredding the incoming Stone Edge and Stealth Rocks. Rock Tomb. He stomped the ground, and 5 to 6 meter high stone pillars erupted from the earth, smashing the remaining invisible rocks and forming a field of obstacles. Rock Tomb? Why use it like that? The ideas of wild Pokémon are different from ours. Just watch. I'm just curious why his rocks are so big. Isn't that a bit much? Come to think of it, he's huge himself. That Septal is strange. Will's use of Rock Tomb caused a stir among the crowd. Most didn't understand the strategy. But Will couldn't explain. Most Pokémon only use enough energy to get the desired effect. But he had to pour in much more energy to make these pillars taller and sturdier, enough to withstand his repeated stomps. Is that, to aid his movement? Gavin saw it at a glance. He immediately understood Will's intention. A brilliant idea. If you had never fought a Sceptile in a forest, you would never think of this. But Gavin had. He knew the difference in its combat power in a forest was like night and day. The next moment, his judgment was confirmed. One after another, fast-moving Sceptile clones burst from behind the giant rocks. Double team. Agility. With the combination of these two skills, a dozen Sceptile began to weave and leap between the rocks on the field, rapidly closing in on the golem. The golem's eyes darted left and right. It was already difficult to track just one of them, let alone pick out the real one from so many. In a situation like this, it all came down to the trainer's quick thinking. Golem. Gyro ball. Let's use those rocks too. Golem. Without a word, the golem tucked in its head and limbs and turned into a high-speed spinning ball, crashing into the stone pillars. Boom. The powerful steel-type physical move shattered a pillar on impact, then ricocheted to the next. One by one, the pillars were destroyed, and one by one, the clones were dispersed. The scene that had made the scalps of so many trainers tingle had been dismantled with ease. The trainers standing near Gavin were thrilled, feeling they had learned something. But then, just as the golem was rolling through a certain spot. Boom! The ground suddenly exploded. Focus blast! A giant Sceptile burst from the earth, a golden, high-speed rotating energy ball in its hands, and slammed it upwards into the golem's abdomen. Golem! The golem was blasted into the air, roaring in pain. The double damage from the fighting-type move, combined with it being a special attack that matched Sceptile's stats, was super effective. But Will's real killer move wasn't that. Extreme speed. He stared at the airborne golem, kicked off the ground, and shot upwards in a streak of light. The golem was in mid-air, almost completely unable to fight back. This was the best moment to intercept. Focus energy. Leaf blade. The leaves on Will's arms suddenly extended, becoming two sharp blades glowing with green light. Slash. One of the blades cut across the golem's head. Its eyes rolled back, and it was on the verge of fainting. But its willpower was strong. It gritted its teeth and held on. Whoa! Now it was Will's turn to be surprised. A 4x super effective hit, boosted by 3 dragon dances, 3 swords dances, the speed of extreme speed, and a critical hit from focus energy. Forget his own enhanced stats, even a normal Sceptile would have had a high chance of a one-hit KO, unless the golem had the sturdy ability. And he had even used Focus Blast first just in case. But this golem had still held on. The concept of willpower, something that doesn't exist in the games, was truly terrifying. It was like a second ability. In a life-or-death battle, the effect of this willpower was immeasurable. Just look at the movies and manga. The combination of bond and will was strong enough to bring the dead back to life, to forcibly twist the timeline, to allow an ordinary Pokémon to one-shot a god. But in a small, ordinary battle like this, it's up to the trainer's choice, Will thought, looking at Gavin. If he forced the golem to keep fighting, and it managed to grab him and use explosion, with its 250 base power, its high attack stat, and its 8-level advantage, it might just be able to take Will down with it. But first, it had to grab him. That alone was almost impossible. And Will still had his focus band. Golem, return. You've worked hard, Gavin said, making the wise choice. Forcing it to continue would only cause it more pain. There was no point. Even if it managed to take Will down, it would be meaningless. This was just an insignificant little match, there was no prize money or trophy. It would only result in both Pokémon being seriously injured. Even worse, an explosion from a golem of this level had a 100% chance of taking out some of the spectators and weaker Pokémon with it. And that taking out didn't just mean fainting. I lost. Sceptile, you are the strongest Sceptile I have ever met. Bar none, Gavin said, giving Will a decisive thumbs up and a grin. He wasn't too upset about his defeat. This was also a characteristic of this era. Because the competitive scene was not yet intense, most trainers' desire to win was not particularly strong. Even if they lost, they could quickly recover and not be discouraged. They just loved the activity of Pokémon battling and enjoyed the feeling of fighting alongside their partners.
Thanks for listening.